Um, Hi, everybody. Let's get going on chapter 11. Now, a couple of things before we get going on this chapter. Number one, this is my very favorite chapter in the entire textbook. Okay, that's good and bad. It's good because I know it pretty much backwards and forwards, and I think it's the most fun. And the reason that I say that is because it's more interesting than previous chapters, I think, in most people's opinion, certainly in my own. Secondly, I believe this chapter is something where you're going to learn things that you can take forward and actually use, whether or not you ever make it to a mental health profession. Um, we're all going to have people in our lives, significant others, bosses, coworkers, whatnot. And sometimes people do and say things that are just weird. They're out of character. They don't make a lot of sense, right? And I'm not trying to. This class is not designed to train you to be able to, read into a person's soul and know how they feel. But if you understand sort of some basic dimensions of personality, especially when we talk about the defense mechanisms, I think it affords you a good insight sometimes into people's somewhat erratic behavior. So, the biopsychology stuff, that's great, it's useful, but if you don't, you're not going to use that in daily life for the most part, right? Same thing with the research chapter. Sure, you might come across research in your daily life and be able to, navigate good research from bad a little bit because of the chapter in this course. But I think by and large, this chapter, more than any other in the book, really lends itself to everyday living and usefulness. So the applicability of this chapter, I think, is what's interesting to me. So anyway, but the downside is because I know a lot about this chapter, I'm going to talk a lot. And this is going to be probably the very longest of all of them. You're probably going to have to watch this one in pieces if you're not already doing that, and that's fine. Understand this is, usually a Monday, Wednesday type class where we meet for 50 minutes twice a week. And I might spend a week and a half on this chapter. So very easily lecture for 3 hours on this chapter. I'm going to try to keep it less than that. But anyway, those are the disclaimers. So without further ado, I haven't said that tag phrase in a couple chapters now. Let's get started. All right, so this is chapter 11. If you notice, we're not going sequential out of the book, and that's okay. For an intro class, you don't really have to. They don't necessarily build on one another. This one, time-wise, I think fits better with the previous chapters that we've been talking about. Again, because it's a little lengthier, so it matched up. All right, so learning objectives, we're going to talk about psychoanalytic theories. We're going to talk just a little bit about humanistic theories. We're going to talk, again, just kind of a little bit about trait theories. Some social cognitive theories we'll mention. And then the last part, I have the hiccups. And then the last part is the personality assessment. I love that part. All right, so let's talk about this guy. If you haven't read that, don't read that. I'm covering it on my screen, but that doesn't help because you can still read it. Anyway, this is Sigmund Freud, one of his most famous pictures, smoking his famous cigar. Man always had a cigar in his hand. So, this chapter is not about Freud, it's about personality. But Freud pretty much blazed that trail for the most part. He wasn't the very first person to study it, but he certainly made it famous. He really kind of introduced the first model, as you can see there at the bottom of that slide. So who is Sigmund Freud? Well, Sigmund Freud was a medical doctor. He worked in an asylum, an insane asylum, which I guess we don't call them that anymore, but that's what they were back then. And he did, excuse me, he did a lot of case studies with the people under his care. Most of them obviously mentally ill of various degrees. And I briefly mentioned in case studies before, Sigmund Freud based a lot of his theories on case studies. And remember we talked about case studies can't be overgeneralized to the general population, right? You can dive deep into one person and find out everything that makes them tick. But it's hard to generalize that to the masses and say this would make everybody do this because we are all individuals and we are all shaped by individual circumstances differently. So that's one of the scrutinies that Freud faced early on was that a lot of his theories were born from case studies that he generalized to the masses. And people said, yeah, you can't really do that. All right, you're studying crazy people and saying this would apply to a normal person and perhaps it wouldn't. So that's one of his criticisms, but it's not the biggest one. We'll get to that in a minute. So he was a student of Ernst von Bruck, who is not a huge name in the field, but I guess during that time, he was a very respectable person. He is the one that coined the term psychodynamic. Now, during that time, right, scientists borrowed from one another as much as they could, especially the scientists that were up here, your Darwins, your Newtons, people like that, that had really prestige in their field. Well, of course, you want to borrow from them. So the Newtonian law of thermodynamics, saying that energy cannot be created nor destroyed, but changes from one form to another, this concept, Freud believed, applied to our mental processes, our psyche, as he would say. And so what happens is we have this negative, perhaps, energy, and we don't like that, right? We don't want that feeling. So what we do is we convert it to something else. We can't get rid of it, right? Because it's basically psychic energy. It's made up of energy. It's made up of electrical impulses, and we can't just snap our fingers and destroy it, right? That would be against the laws of physics. But what we can do is convert it to something else, something more tolerable. So you'll see a lot of his defense mechanisms are built on this basic concept of psychodynamics, of taking something and converting it to something else. Don't worry about these dates as far as memorizing them. I've told you I'll never ask you that. I just want you to have a general reference of time so you kind of understand roughly when this was going on. Freud was the first person to introduce the real model of personality, and this is kind of what he's famous for. He's famous for a couple of things, but probably more than anything, he is famous for this: the id, the ego, and the superego. This is Freud's psychodynamic model of personality. So we're going to go through this so that you understand all the parts, okay? Now, the first part of our personality is made up of what Freud called the id. The id consists of all of our primitive drives. It's present at birth, and it's what I like to call kind of the toddler that exists in all of us, right? When we throw a temper tantrum and we act immature and silly, even as an adult sometimes, we don't get our way, and we quite literally stomp our foot and pout. That's our id expressing ourselves, right? So it's present at birth, and it never really goes away, right? Now, as we age just a little bit, right, the ego starts to develop. This is the self that other people see, right? This is the part of us that starts to grow up. Now, what happens is we have this primitive id, and then we have this evolving ego that tries to balance out the id, all right? And so for the rest of our lives, we have this juggling act, right, where our total personality tries to sort of deal with the id, because we can't get rid of it, right, by counterbalancing it with the ego, and then a little later the superego, and all of these things should be in harmony. But what you'll find is very often they're not in harmony. And when they're not in harmony, there is consequences, and we'll explain that. So the superego is the third part. It's the internalization of society's rules for right and wrong. This is kind of the big rule book that's written for us by literally everybody, by our peers, our families, our friends, just our social fabric of what is acceptable. All sort of becomes the guideline, if you will, which is the superego. So this is the basic. Now we're going to break it down a little bit more, right? So we have the id, which is the primitive drive. We have the ego, which is the self, our general sense of self. And then we have the superego, which is our conscience. Now, remember when we talked about the, chapter 4 on consciousness? And I said that there's two different words and they're spelled differently and they mean different things, but they're said the same and sometimes they're confused. This is the other one. So conscious, meaning, oh, he drank too much and he's no longer conscious, meaning he is no longer aware. He's no longer awake, right? He's in an altered state of consciousness. In this stage, a drunken stupor, right? That is conscious. This conscience, C-O-N, and then the word science is how I remember it. Conscience has to do with that little guy, these little guys, right? The devil on your shoulder, the angel on your shoulder, and you're constantly sort of mediating between the two, right? This is your sense of morals and right and wrong. That is your conscience, right? You do something, you have a guilty conscience. So it's a different spelling, different word, all right? So let's break down these three parts just a little bit more. I'll make this a little bit bigger. You don't need to see my ugly mug. All right, the id. The id is driven by something called the pleasure principle, all right? So again, this is that toddler inside of us, right? And what do toddlers want? Well, they want everything, and they want it right now, not not tomorrow. They don't want to wait, right? They want it right now. It's all about immediate gratification, and they don't worry about how they look. Have you ever seen a toddler in Target in the checkout line crying for a piece of candy and everybody's looking at him? Have you ever seen a toddler look around, see all the negative attention that he's gathering for himself, and then suddenly self-soothe and stop crying? No, they don't have a conscience yet. They don't worry about what other people see and what other people think, right? They're not mature enough. They're not old enough for that yet. So this id is it's driven by the pleasure principle, as I said, seeks immediate gratification without conscience, without planning for consequences. So the toddler's not thinking about consequences. It just knows, look, I want that. I want it right now. I don't care. I just want it and I want to do it. And even as an adult, sometimes we give in to these id desires, right? We still make these spontaneous purchases that, perhaps we didn't think through very well, or we rationalize, and we'll get to why that happens. But if that want goes unsatisfied, in other words, if the id comes out and says, I want that, and for whatever reason, you don't satisfy that desire, then Freud says psychic energy begins to sort of build up. Now, this word psychic is not reading minds and levitating things and kind of how Hollywood uses the word psychic these days, right? It just means of the mind. So whenever he says psychic energy, he means energy of the mind. That's really all he's referring to. Nothing supernatural or, sixth sense kind of stuff, right? So if an id desire goes unsatisfied, then psychic energy, mental energy, starts to be created and it becomes anxiety and stress. That's how we feel anxious or stressed out, is because we have this unfulfilled desire. So what happens? Well, remember I said the ego and the superego are sort of the balance to the id. The id, by the way, is super powerful, right? This desire to want things, right? It's sometimes overwhelmingly powerful. So we have to have something to balance that out. So that's where the ego comes in. The ego is governed by something called the reality principle. So we have the pleasure principle, which is the id. I just want what I want right now. Well, then we have that balanced out by the ego that says, now hold on a second. All right, this is the real world. Okay, we have $100 in our bank account. We can't just go buy something that's $100 that you want. We'll have nothing left. What about bills? What about food? What about having a little bit for a rainy day or something like that? That's not going to work, right? So that's the reality principle. That's the ego stepping in. The ego attempts to satisfy the id's desires in a realistic and a socially appropriate way. So it's just like a parent, right? I'm a parent. I have, children that are not toddlers anymore, but whenever they were, I want to give them everything that they want. That's just the natural desire of a parent, right? But then there's that other part of you that knows, I got to be a parent. I know they want candy 24/7, but I can't give them candy 24/7, right? There needs to be a proper diet somewhere in there. And if they have candy before, they're not going to eat their dinner, or they're going to have, bad teeth, or they're going to have, diabetes, or they're going to gain weight, or they're going to feel lethargic because they don't have the proper nutrients. So I know it's not the right thing to do. So sometimes I have to tell them no. And it sucks, right? You don't like being that way, but you know that there's all this reality that we live in that says it's just not practical to give in to everything that you want. So the ego tries to satisfy that desire in a realistic and a socially appropriate manner. So this would be the example of, hey, look, I will buy the candy now, and if you're good for the rest of the night and you eat a good dinner, after dinner, you can have this candy as dessert. Now, what's a toddler going to say to that? No, they're going to cry and wail and say, I want it now, right? Because they don't have that ability to think this way, right? But that's the parenting thing. You're trying to teach them that. So maybe you go ahead and buy it, and then maybe you weather the storm for now and let them cry it out a little bit, and then they get back on track and they're good and they have dinner, and then afterwards you reward them with that. Now we're talking a little bit of Skinner, a little bit of positive reinforcement, right? So now we're trying to encourage that behavior more in the future, and they start to put together and we start to condition. So now you see a couple of different theories at play here, right? But ultimately, we're the ego to their id, right? But for Freud, this exists within all of us. We're not talking a parent, which is one entity, one person, and an id, which is their toddler. This is ourselves trying to police ourselves, right? We have wants, and then we also have this sense of reality and know I can't satisfy all of my wants, so I have to sort of quell that in myself, if that makes any sense, right? So it becomes a little bit philosophical. But our ego, let me make sure I've covered all this, is governed by the reality principle. So know those two. The id is the pleasure principle. The ego is the reality principle, all right? Strives to satisfy the id's desires, right? We want to please that id desire, but we want to do so in an appropriate manner, not just a spur of the moment, no thinking through consequences kind of way, because we can't live life that way, right? Now, we haven't talked about consciousness levels. Now we're flipping back to that other consciousness. This is that awareness that we're talking about, that type of consciousness. So we have things that are conscious, that we're very aware of, right? That's the plain as day. Then we have a component of consciousness that is the subconscious, right? It's just below our level of understanding. Not understanding, that's probably not the best way to put it. It's like, for instance, the air conditioner. If you listen right now, you can probably hear the air conditioner. Now, you didn't notice it a second ago, right? It was operating on kind of a subconscious level. Why? Because inattentional blindness. We weren't paying attention to it. We don't care. It's not important, right? So you're aware of it. It can be brought up to the consciousness level as soon as you focus attention on it, right? That's kind of a subconscious. And then there's the unconscious. And that is something that operates below our level of awareness, period. We are sometimes, most often, we're unable to bring that up to a level of awareness. And a lot of our behavior, according to Freud, is driven by unconscious desires. There are things that happen early on and they kind of shape our behavior, they shape our personality, and for the rest of our life, we may act a certain way and not even realize why we're acting that way. And then we talk to a trained professional, a psychoanalyst, and they're able to kind of go all the way back to the beginning and sometimes trace that behavior and see where it came from. And that's sort of the model for psychodynamic therapy is let's go back to the beginning and let's see where this formed in the first place. And that's going to take some digging because you are not even aware of it. So now I have to step in and I have to dig through your childhood and try to find this thing that you're not even aware of, and then I can piece together, aha, that's why you act the way that you act. And then once that's discovered, then we can maybe work on changing it. So the ego operates on all consciousness levels, and we'll see this, let me get to that right now. So this is a very famous picture, you'll see this in every intro book known to man. And it's an iceberg. If you don't know, they say that the vast majority of icebergs, as large as they are, I mean, sometimes they look like mountains in the ocean, right? But the vast majority of them are actually under the water that you can't see. So you're really just seeing the tip of the iceberg, as the saying goes. So that analogy is sort of used here for these levels of consciousness, right? So we have our consciousness, that's what we're aware of, that's what we can see, right? We have the pre-conscious, also sometimes called the subconscious, right? Sub meaning under. So it's just under our level of conscious awareness. But again, we can call this up. We can look really hard and we can see that, all right? Then we sort of have this imaginary line and everything below that is unconscious. And look at the proportions. Okay, that's significant and that's drawn that way on purpose. So, a very small proportion is pre-conscious. We're either most of the time aware of it or we're not. But the vast majority of our sort of thinking, our mental processes, what makes us us, is unconscious. So basically, like our brain is this computer and it's wired to sort of run. And once we type in the program and hit go, it's just kind of operating in the background, right? We're not really aware of all the ones and zeros, all the things, all the computations that are being made, a million times a second, right? All that's sort of on autopilot on the unconscious level down here, right? And again, it goes back to that whole, the brain uses a ton of energy. And so we're trying to sort of minimize that, and we want to automate everything that we can for those energy reserves, and then we can really focus our energy on this conscious awareness level, all right? So this is kind of your consciousness levels. A Freudian slip, if you've never heard that term before, a Freudian slip is a psychological error in speaking. And that's when you're trying to say something and something from your preconscious or maybe your unconscious pops up to the top. and something comes out of your mouth that you're not really, that's not really what you meant. Okay, if you look at the video clips, I'll include a YouTube clip on Freudian slips. There's some on news bloopers. They're pretty hilarious. And the best Christmas movie of all time, National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. Yeah, best Christmas movie of all time. I watch it every year. There's a great scene where Clark is at a department store shopping, and he's talking to a very pretty sales clerk, and a lot of Freudian slips are coming out. Now, most of the time, Freudian slips are sexual in nature. Why is that? Well, going back to Freud, Freud believed that the psychic energy that we have most of the time is driven, for men anyway, and most of the time he spoke of men. Remember, in this time, right, men kind of ruled the world, right? So at this time, all these theories were based on, how men think and what men want and all that kind of stuff. And there's far less attention really kind of given to female thought. So they are a little bit misogynistic, some of his theories, but he talks a lot about libido, and he talks a lot about the power of libido to drive our decisions. And so you have to remember, in his time, I mean, married couples a lot of time had separate beds. It was unheard of to be in somebody's married bedroom, because you might see a singular bed, and what automatically are you thinking whenever you see a single bed that's occupied by a man and woman? Oh my God, naughty things happen there, right? People just didn't talk about sex at all. It was totally taboo. And so here's Freud talking about it openly, and talking about this sexual desire of a man driving his behavior, and a lot of it is unconscious. We're not even aware of it. We just act on it like animalistic, and we're sort of unable to control it. And what we do is our id, right? Primitive drive. So sexual drive would be a primitive drive. So this would be an id-driven thing, right? So we have this immediate thing that we want, right? The pleasure principle, some sexual thing that we want. And so we just do it. We go after it 100%, right? And our ego is saying, well, wait a second, we probably shouldn't do that. Society would frown upon it, or perhaps you're married and, you have an opportunity to step out, and, your id is like, do it, right? And your ego is like, well, now hold on a second. Now that sort of goes against the rules. We haven't talked about superego yet, but that would step in here as well. And so what we do is we rationalize a reason why it's okay, and we do it anyway. So this was a very powerful thing, recurring theme in all of Freud's different theories on personality and stages of development, and all these different theories that he's famous for. And at the time, it just didn't set well with people. He talked too much about sex, and it was very off-putting for people. And so what we ended up having was sort of an offshoot of people that followed his teachings for the most part, but they wanted to get away from the sexualization of all of his theories. And so we had our neo-Freudians that stepped out, and they kind of abandoned that notion, but kept most of the rest, all right? So, this is normally, we have a little bit of a conversation here about that. What do you think? Do you think he was far off the mark and wrong? Or do you think he was just ahead of his time and talked about something that's very accurate, but we just couldn't talk about it back then? And I can't help but think of all of the people who have thrown away so much for so little. Your Bill Clintons that has an affair with, a not, at the time, not particularly attractive Monica Lewinsky. Now, granted, she's really pretty now, but back then she wasn't all that great, right? And this is the most powerful man in the world. Probably could have, at the very least, paid for any beautiful woman that he wanted, right? And done it discreetly, but instead he did what he did. What drives somebody to throw away the legacy of a presidency and get impeached, possibly divorced, lose his office over that, over 5 minutes of what he got? I mean, so don't tell me that it's not powerful, and don't tell me that it doesn't drive behavior. The list is a mile long. Hugh Grant married to Elizabeth Hurley, a literally supermodel, one of the, if not the, most beautiful women in the world. And what does he do? He pays $20 to a hooker walking down the street for a sexual act that he gets caught for, and tarnishes his name, tarnishes his reputation, ruins his marriage, gets a criminal charge put on him, risks disease. For what? For 10 minutes or something, he could have got it home from somebody that was far more attractive. So again, and again, the list just goes on and on and on. Famous people, celebrities, politicians, it doesn't matter. Guys suck and they do stupid things. And Freud pointed out that it was this libido, this sexual energy that drives this behavior that's almost just impossible to fight, because we can either fight it and then we're here. We're fighting it and we are, let's see, where is it? If the want goes unsatisfied, psychic energy created by the id becomes anxiety and stress. We don't want that. So if I fight that urge and I don't give into it, well, then I'm stressed out and I feel anxious and depressed and sad and all these other negative things, right? So the other alternative is to just give in to the id, do it, but then the ego is hurt because the ego knows I'm not supposed to do this, right? That goes against the socially appropriate way that we should behave. So we have an ego defense mechanism, and we'll get to that in a second, right? This is the way that we make bad choices and we rationalize those bad choices. All right, so we're going to get to that. I know I'm skipping around a little bit and talking really fast, but again, I could talk for hours about this chapter, so I'm trying to get it all in. So we've talked about the id being driven by the pleasure principle. We've talked about the ego being driven by the reality principle, sort of counterbalances that. And the ego operates on all consciousness levels, weighs the cost and benefits, and it does what's called delayed gratification. So remember when I was talking about the toddler, I said, let's buy it now, but have that candy later, like after dinner? That's delayed gratification, all right? I want this now, and I could go purchase it, but then I'll be broke until next payday. So why don't I maybe put it on layaway? And that way they'll hold it, and I can put a down payment on it, but I can still have money in the bank for 2 weeks, and then when I get paid again, I can come back, pay it off, and then I'll have it. Granted, I have to wait 2 weeks, but that is the financially smarter decision. That is the more mature decision. Just in case something goes wrong and I need money, I'd rather have it, not need it, than need it and not have it, right? So that's the ego sort of stepping in, trying to balance out the id. Now, the super ego is a little more philosophical. It's a little more abstract. I mean, all of this is abstract, but this is even more so. It forms around age 5, and it's divided into 2 parts. So the first part is called the ego ideal. This is that rule book that I was talking about. It includes the rules and standards for good behavior. Now, where did we get these? Now, think about the age, right? Before 5, we have parents, right? That's pretty much it. Unless you're from a rich family, maybe you have a nanny. But for the most part, parents. Maybe some extended family if you're, close with grandma and things like that. Probably get a little bit of that as well. But for the most part, our parents drive that. Now, once we get to 5, what happens? What's different in our life at 5 years old? We start school, right? So now we have teachers. And teachers are very, very important in the developmental maturation of the superego. They're sort of complementary to what we get from the parent. So the parent has been the driving force, and now all of a sudden we have this teacher who we begin to look up to as a different kind of peer, and they are providing much of the same information as the parent, hopefully. And so it's validating what we've already gotten from the parent. And that's super important. And the other thing is they might be adding new things, like how to act in a group. You're a child, you're at home, you might have a brother or sister, but that's not really a group. So then you get to kindergarten, and now you have a classroom. And there's 20 of you. And teachers are really good with classroom management, especially in kindergarten, of teaching you, remember all the things that we learned, and I still remember, right? Crisscross applesauce. We had to sit there, and they put their fingers like this, and then they count. And whenever you see that and you're talking to your friends and you see your teacher doing that, you immediately copy that behavior. You put your finger over your mouth and you get to whatever number or whatever, and the whole room gets quiet. And you learn that you can't talk while the teacher's talking, right? You can't carry on this conversation. You're going to get called out. You're going to get punished. You're going to get embarrassed. And honestly, it just doesn't work. You can't have a classroom where everybody can carry on their conversations. There needs to be leaders and followers, and the students should be the followers. So you start to learn all of this stuff from your teachers. So we have parents, we have societal and religious standards, we have other authority figures and role models, mostly parents at this stage. Obeying the strict standards develop a sense of pride, accomplishment, and value. So We go to this classroom, we see this behavior, we learn it, and we act on it, and we're not called out. We don't get in trouble, and our teacher likes us, and they say nice things to us, and they put little gold stickers on our work sometimes when we do well, and that makes us feel good, right? We feel all these positive things. Now, what happens when we don't get them for whatever reason? Maybe we're not getting that attention at home, and so we come to the classroom and we want attention because we're starved for it. And so we throw ourselves out of our chair onto the floor because we want the attention of the classroom. And even negative attention is better than no attention to especially a small child. So you see this kind of acting out behavior quite a bit. And on the surface, you get that attention and it feels kind of good. You're sort of scratching that itch to some extent. But deep down, you're not supposed to be doing that. You're the only one in the classroom doing it, right? Everybody else is acting normal and they're not, throwing themselves on the floor and whatnot. So deep down, we have feelings of guilt and shame. We're kind of ashamed that we're doing what we're doing. So it's very much a quick fix. And we grow up with this and we start to internalize this over time and bottle it up. And tell me you don't think that that's going to lead to issues in adulthood, right? So this is, again, the reason that psychoanalysts believe you should go all the way back to childhood and really kind of see where things went off the rails, all right? Not everybody navigates those developmental years very well. Sometimes it's through issues of parenting. Sometimes it's bullying. Their social fabric wasn't really great. There's all kinds of reasons that it could go sideways. So the second part within the superego is our conscious, which we've mentioned, right? This is the considered bad. What's considered bad by those in authority? Breaking these rules leads to guilt, shame, and remorse. Now, what happens when we don't really have any role models? Maybe parents, very sort of hands-off parenting style. They don't really ever ask about your day. They don't really ever give you any praise. Anything you ever do could have been a little bit better. You have those kind of parents that aren't very nurturing. They're not very close. And then you have teachers that you're just another student, right? I mean, we've all had teachers that really care. And then we've had teachers that are just basically earning a paycheck, and maybe not even very well. So if you're one of those bad situations where you have those parents that could use some lessons and you go to school with a teacher who doesn't really care, you sometimes don't form much of a conscience, right? You don't really have a sense of pride or accomplishment or value. All you really have is guilt, shame, and remorse, and you bottle that up. So your Ted Bundys and Jeffrey Dahmers and all of your famous serial killers, and they talk about how they have these horrible upbringings and their parenting went sideways. They were abused and things like that. The psychoanalytic theory behind that is that they didn't properly develop a superego. That sense of right and wrong, that sense of guilt and remorse, they don't have that. They have no conscience whatsoever. That they can do whatever they need to do, that psychopathic tendencies, and it just doesn't bother them. They don't care about people, but nobody ever cared about them, so they don't understand what it means to have empathy for other people. Very much a psychodynamic theory. So, once again, very quickly, we have the id, the ego, the superego. The id driven by the pleasure principle, and that's that toddler inside that just wants what it wants right now, doesn't care about consequences, doesn't think things through. I want it right now. To balance that, we have the ego, which is governed by the reality principle, and it seeks ways to accommodate, but in a realistic and a socially appropriate way, often through delayed gratification. A promise to do it, but do it at a later date under different, better circumstances. And then we have the superego, which kind of works in concert with the ego, and this is mostly that rule book of right and wrong, good behavior and bad behavior. All right, so let's put that into an application. If you haven't noticed, I'm a bit of a comic fan. So here's a quick, thrown together. So Hulk. Hulk is not Professor Hulk, right? We're not talking about Avengers Hulk. We're talking about just regular Hulk. He is a pretty good example of the id, right? Battle in New York City, he has to fight the Chitauri, and he just wants to smash, right? Hulk smash. So do you think he thinks very much about property damage? Do you think he thinks about the owner of that car that he picks up and uses as boxing gloves? He doesn't care about any of that stuff, right? That's very much id behavior, right? No thoughts about consequences, no thoughts about anything other than, I want to smash, so I'm going to. And I'm using the term from the movie, not the colloquial term that we've come to understand that to mean. That's not what I meant. So anyways, Hulk smash, famous line, and that's what he does. Literally smashes things. Now let's go to the other end. So then we have Captain America, right? If you haven't noticed, he's kind of my favorite. You can't even see all the stuff around me, but I have can you see that? Like I have a whole bunch of, everything, and the shield and everything, it's ridiculous. So he is sort of the personification of the superego, right? Remember in Civil War, if you've seen that, he decides that his team, who is considering signing the Wachovia Accords, that he doesn't feel that that's right. And instead of going along with the team, he actually goes against them and stands up for what he believes in. And there's a whole speech in I think it was in that movie, where he talks about, he was at the death of, was it Peggy Carter's funeral maybe? I can't remember now, it's been a while. But anyway, he's talking about how she said, sometimes you have to plant your feet firmly whenever the whole world's telling you to move, and you have to say, no, you move. And that's kind of what he does. Like, he stands up for what he believes in. He's got a very, very, very strong, principled sort of background. So when we look at his superego, right, all these rules that he's gotten for society and how society should be and all that stuff, he is going to follow that, no matter what it means, right? He believes that, and his sense of pride and value will not be compromised, right? He's not going to sell out and sign this thing and be an agent of the government. And then in the middle, we kind of have Spider-Man. He's kind of just your average, he's got a conscience. He thinks about right and wrong. With great power comes great responsibility. So he's aware of what he needs to do. He's just kind of operates, I think, pretty well balanced between, these two sort of extremes. So just a quick example. All right, so last thing about Freud, let's talk about what it would look like if these were imbalanced. So in a perfect world, your id, your ego, and your superego are all in balance with one another, all right? But we all know we don't live in a perfect world. So what would it look like if a person's personality one of these sort of underdeveloped? Well, somebody that had a dominant id, right? That's that toddler part of us, right? Well, you're going to see somebody that's very impulsive and uncontrollable, right? Think of how a toddler would be. This is a very immature person. They're going to be very likely a criminal because, criminals often, they want something, they take it. They just steal it. They don't think through consequences. They don't like something that you said, they punch you in the face, right? They're aggressive a lot of times, if they have the ability to be so. Very selfish, right? Obviously, they want what they want. They don't care what that means to you. They can be rude because they're not empathetic to your feelings. So they're very dominant id people. They're probably not well liked. They probably don't hold a job for very long. They probably don't have very many friends, and the ones they do are probably somewhat superficial and short-lived. Because nobody wants a selfish friend. It's just why there's plenty of people in the world. I'll drop you and go find somebody else that will actually help me when I need help. So your dominant id people, those are pretty easy to spot. Dominant ego, I think these are fairly interesting people. So let's say that you grew up somewhat dominant id for whatever reason, right? Maybe your parents were very dominating parents. Maybe you had a sibling rivalry. Why can't I say that? That with another, your brother or sister or whatever, that really drove you to be this kind of hyper-aggressive, selfish, gimme, mine kind of person. And that's the way you grew up. And then at some point, and this doesn't happen often, at some point you have a sense of enlightenment. And you realize, oh, man, I'm in need of some adjustment. You have an aha moment, an epiphany. Maybe you lose a marriage over it. And so you decide, I need to work on that. So you decide that you want to really feed your ego. You want to build your ego up. Now, that means that you're going to have to suppress your id to some extent. So what happens is you suppress that id to the point that now your ego is dominant over the id, but you live in fear that someday that id is going to break through those chains and it's going to take you over again. And you don't want that. So you always have your foot on that id, right? You are always just driving it away, driving it away, driving it away, and you're focused on that ego, focused on that ego. Now remember what I said about balance. All these things should be in balance. That doesn't mean make the id go away. That's not a bad thing. To have spontaneous desires and to want things, those are good things. That's a normal part of living, right? We need that in our lives, but we can't be ruled by it. So now we go the other way, and we are ruled by this ego. Well, we're going to be extremely rigid and unable to stray from rule or structure. We're going to be unable to be spontaneous because that is an id impulse, and we are dominant ego. We're repressing our id as much as possible. Probably this is going to lead to somebody who's very stressed and very anxious with an overly developed sense of personal principles. Now, if you didn't pick it up, this is me. I am very much dominant ego. And the reason is I spent a good portion of my early life dominant id. Very narcissistic, very controlling, very selfish. I had parents that didn't, I've never heard an I love you from my parents ever. I've never gotten praise from anything I've ever done. And I've done some pretty good things. And whenever I do the good things, it's like it makes my dad specifically, it makes him uncomfortable. I brought home a report card one time, accidentally. I wasn't trying hard. I brought home a report card one time that was all A's and a B. And I saw it and I'm like, oh, wow, I did pretty good this 6 weeks. And I showed it to him, and what I got was, it was almost straight A's. All right, okay, fair enough. So the next 6 weeks, I put just a little bit of effort in, and I got straight A's. And I was like, I'm kind of like, take that. What are you going to say to that? You know what he said? Well, you got a 90 in math. I mean, that's just barely an A. So that's what I grew up with, right? So it didn't matter. I was first chair symphonic band. I was first chair region. I was first chair state. I got a scholarship to college for music. I didn't care about that. I wasn't trying to be good. I would come home and I would practice because if I missed a note, I heard about it and I didn't want to hear about it. So I just played and played and played until I was the best, and I was the best in the state. And I went to the concert and I had a solo and I nailed it. And what I got was, I didn't really like that song too much. You couldn't really hear the trumpets very well. So, just you grow up like that, right? And you're seeking this praise, right, all the time that you don't ever get. And so you start to just praise yourself and tell yourself how awesome you are. But because you're a child and developing, you don't really know where those limits are. And so what happens is you overpraise and you think you're just the best, right? So that's how a narcissist is born. So then, you get to a certain point in your life and you lose everything. You lose your marriage, you lose your career, you lose everything. And you look in the mirror and you're like, how can I be so awesome? And this is my life, right? It's kind of hard to be narcissistic whenever you're unemployed and single and live with your parents, right? So you start to take a hard look at your life, especially if you have a little bit of knowledge about this, and you start to sort of look at these imbalances for maybe the first time. And you say, I'm going to be better. I'm going to be less selfish, less narcissistic, and I'm going to squash this id a little bit, and it's hard. And the next thing you know, you've sort of succeeded, but like I mentioned, you have this fear that you're going to regress and that it's just a temporary fix, and you're going to go right back to the way that you were because people don't change, especially adults. So you work really hard to keep this change, but what ends up happening is you become dominant ego. And so you have all these things. And so now little things, I've always hated snitches. I never considered myself one. And now it's like anytime I see something, first of all, I feel like I need to step in. If you're on your phone in a movie, I will say something to you. If you're at the gym and and I see a lot of gym etiquette issues going on at the gym, you get done with the machine and you go to walk away and you don't take the weights off,
I will say something to you. I don't know how big you are. Hey man, are you going to leave all those weights on there for somebody else? Or are you going to take them down? And I've had some interesting conversations because I feel like I need to be the one to step in when nobody else does. And it's a horrible quality. It's my least best quality, I think. But yeah, I am unable to stray from rules or structure. Look, the rule says strip the weights before you leave. If you don't do that, it doesn't compute up here for me. For whatever reason, it's like you're not allowed to do that. That's id behavior. You're allowing your id to go, I don't want to, and then walk away. And that's not how the world works. So you need to come back here and fix that because it's bothering my sense of, id and ego balance. So yeah, that's what a dominant ego looks like, and it's not fun. All right, dominant superego. This is an extremely moralistic individual. This is somebody who takes that rule book and they follow it to a T, and they don't really develop a personal sense of right and wrong. And best example of this, and I feel like I might have given this before, but I can't remember, so I'm sorry if I've used this analogy already, but I guess metaphor. So there was a police officer that worked in Dallas. No, I did not know him, but he was sitting in a parking lot at night, and middle of the night, and in front of kind of a little nothing intersection, but an intersection nonetheless, and a black Escalade flies through the red light. Okay, what are you supposed to do? Well, you got to pull him over, right? So he gets behind him, he turns on his lights, coming up to the next intersection, he blasts through that light as well. So this happens, and he goes through like 3 or 4 lights or whatever, and he pulls into Baylor Hospital. I think I have told this, so I'm going to tell a short version. So he gets to the ER at Baylor Hospital, and all 4 doors open up, and it's 3 women and 1 male, all black driver and white police officer, and he gets at gunpoint, hey, close the door, stay in the car. He's going to basically make them wait there, and he's going to get covered. I totally agree with everything at this point, right? You don't know what the situation is, you don't know what's happening, although might start to clue in a little bit that they're at an ER at a hospital, right? So at this point, maybe not at gunpoint, right? I don't agree with that, but it is a felony, right? He's evaded, so we're talking felony arrest. He's handling a felony stop. He's doing the proper procedure for a felony stop. But ultimately, it was a medical emergency, and the 3 women just said, "Screw this," and they just went inside. They're like, "What are you going to shoot me?" And they went inside. So, good for them. The driver was compliant. He did not want to throw the dice on that. So he stayed and was chastised for his reckless driving. He was issued 3 or 4 handwritten tickets, all of them completely filled out before they were given to him for him to sign and give back. So it took 15, 20 minutes. And by the time he got inside to see his dying mother, she had already passed. So it turns out this guy was a former NFL player and went on all the talk shows and talked about the incident. And he was actually pretty nice about it. I mean, he wasn't like hating on the officer, but he was definitely, not happy with the situation. But he was very professional and I think very well spoken about how he handled it. And that officer was fired. And there was a big thing about it. They were like, well, wait a second. So you fired the police officer? So he's sitting there and this guy blasts through red lights and intersection without even attempting to slow down. He does it like 3 or 4 times. He fails to pull over. He has committed these traffic violations. The officer got behind him, didn't put hands on him. He did a felony stop the proper way, and then he actually started to do a felony stop. And then I think it dawned on him like what was going on. And once the women left, he just walked up. He didn't get the guy, put him down on the ground. He didn't do any of that stuff. He just approached him. The guy was very compliant, and he didn't feel that there was a threat at that point. So he reholstered and just talked to the guy. So I mean, there's a little bit of discretion on the part of the officer. He talks to him. He explained to him that, I don't care what you got going on. You don't have the right to endanger the public by driving that way. I'm going to issue your citations, and you can go on about your business. I could put you in jail. I'm not going to. I could charge you with a felony. I'm not going to. So here's, the badge people saying, dude, this cop, was very lenient. I mean, he could have done a lot worse than what he did and been justified, and you're firing him? And people came to me, and I'm very pro-police, and they were like, what do you think? And I said, I think he should be fired. I mean, just to be honest, I don't know the guy, but based on the totality of circumstances, that is a dominant superego person. That is somebody that understands the law, and they know that I have the right to do this, but it's, in my opinion, and that's all it is, my opinion, it's a misapplication of the law. All right, your sense of what's right and what's wrong. Look, could he have hurt somebody? Absolutely. All right, should he be talked to? Absolutely. Is now the time? No. You know who he is, right? You have his driver's license. Hey, go in there and take care of your business, and we'll be in contact. You know, I don't know how practical it is to really do that, but you could issue tickets after the fact, you know, and have them mailed. You don't have to hand them to him. You know, if we had a better proactive police system, you could have gone the next day and talked to him, and assuming everything worked out with the family emergency situation, just been like, hey, look, you know, now that that's over with and we can just talk, you know, you really put a lot of people in danger, including myself, you know, blah, 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 blah. Not that it would ever happen again, but, you know, maybe that's your sense of duty coming in and saying, hey, you know, stern warning, blah, blah, blah. But none of that happened. He just, you know, held the guy, gave him the tickets, and I don't think that was a proper use of, you know, police power. So I don't think you can retrain that. I think that is a deep personality flaw that he has, is a dominant superego. And I think that if you don't have these in balance pretty well, then that is just probably not a profession for you. So everybody was surprised by that because, again, I'm pro-police, but you know, I just think that was a very clear demonstration of somebody who was dominant superego, overly moralistic, overly, you know, sense of right and wrong according to the books, but without a personal, you know, touch to the situation. So anyway, so this is I think this is a pretty interesting guide to kind of look at somebody and see, you know, if you feel like they're out of balance or not. You know, I mean, you want to look for this kind of behavior, a little less of this selfishness, a little less of this, you know, the officer that I talked about, maybe a little less of the Captain America attitude, a little bit more in the middle. All right, so I've mentioned this a couple times. Let's talk about defense mechanisms. All right, I absolutely love this part. I think this is the part of the chapter that I think you can use in daily life, freaking almost daily. I mean, I think it happens a lot. So we talked about, I'm going to go back here a little bit. We talked about this id behavior, right, that needs to happen, right? And if I don't get that thing that I want, right, then I become stressed out or anxious or depressed or whatever, sometimes angry. It doesn't have to just be anxiety and stress. It's just basically any negative emotion, right? Because, again, with this whole conversion, right, if I feel stress and I don't like that, then sometimes I just convert it to anger. That's why you see sometimes people that are depressed. And, you know, we have this thought that depressed people are like laying around just moping and just, you know, whatever like that. That's not always how the symptoms of depression manifests. Very often you'll see somebody that's depressed that's angry. They're just yelling at everybody, just every little thing, biting somebody's head off. Why? That's depression, because they're converting their sadness, which is a fairly useless emotion, right? To feel sad is, you know, there's just no control over that, right? And so if I feel sad and I just stay that way, I'm going to get deeper and deeper and deeper into that depression. So we know that, and that sense of self-preservation sometimes kicks in. And the next thing you know, you need to act on something. You need to act. So what do? You kind of overdo it, and you get mad, and you're trying to get that oomph to go do something, and it comes out as just anger, biting everybody's head off. So that's a very common thing that you see. So these are somewhat interchangeable. Anxiety, stress, depression, sometimes anger, all of these, what I would just classify as the umbrella, negative emotions. So we have negative emotions when our id sense is not being satisfied. So our ego wants to give in, but if our ego just gives in, it doesn't really do its job and properly sort of talk that id down off the ledge, right? That's kind of what this is, kind of a hostage negotiator, right? And if you successfully negotiate, look, we'll do this later, and the id is somewhat pleased, then everybody wins, right? The id goes away, no negative feelings, the behavior happens, but at a later, more appropriate time. The id wins because it gets what it wants. The ego wins because it did so in an appropriate way. That is the proper way things happen. But sometimes the id's desire is just too strong. And maybe there is no way to delay gratification. Not everything can be compromised. What if you're in a relationship and one person wants a baby and the other one doesn't? You can't compromise and have half a baby. You know, I mean, you can't. What is a compromise? You get a puppy. Well, I mean, for some that might be a compromise, but to others, that's not a baby. Or you say, okay, we can have a baby, but in 2 years from now. Okay, well, that may work for some, but for other people, that desire to have that baby right now is just too strong. Even though the promise to have it in 2 years, it's just not going to satisfy that. So something has to happen. What happens is a defense mechanism. So they're listed here. I've got, I think, 15 or 16 of them. Yeah, I got 15 of them listed here. I'm going to go through them relatively quickly. They sort of are in an order, all right? I would say that they start off in the most primitive, least helpful, and as the list goes to 13, 14, 15, they're somewhat better. They're less destructive. They're more acceptable. They get better as the list goes on, is what I'm saying. So a defense mechanism is a protective behavior that tends to reduce anxiety. So the ego says, you can't have that, and the id throws a bigger fit and says, I want it anyway. And so the id says, fine. It just gives in and it lets the id have what it wants. Well, now the ego has to deal with that stress and anxiety, right? Because it's not doing its job. So the way that it deals with that, and it reduces the stress, reduces the anxiety, reduces the depression, is it employs one of these defense mechanisms. Now, the number one here that is the most primitive is denial. Denial is simply the refusal to accept reality. All right. I saw this firsthand one time. It was very baffling for me to witness this in person, but I had the unpleasant call one time to deliver a death notification. There was a situation where a woman had been killed in a car accident. She was out of town, actually, and had been involved in a fatal accident. And that police department called our police department to get a hold of next of kin because they were unable to. They had an address but no phone number. So they gave us the address, and we have to go knock on the door and pass the news. So, we knock on the door, and got to make sure that you got the right person. Definitely don't want to deliver that news to the wrong person. So, man answers the door, and we, said, are you such and such, whatever his name is? He said, yes. And we says, is your wife such and such, whatever her name was? And he says, yes. And we said, okay, does she drive such and such car? Again, we have to know that we're talking to the right person. He said, yeah, what's the problem? And we said, well, we're sorry to inform you, but she's been involved in a fatal accident, on route, whatever the situation was. We give him the news, and he just looks at us and he goes, what are you talking about? My wife just left to go out of town yesterday. And we're like, well, we're aware of that, but she was unfortunately involved in this accident. I don't remember what the circumstances were, but we told him briefly what had happened and that she died on the scene, and there was nothing that could be done for her. And is there anything we can do to, and he was like, no, I need to call my wife. And we're like, oh my God, are you not understanding what we're saying to you? And he pulls his phone out and he's like dialing her number. And, we just kind of stand there and we were waiting for him to do, and he gets his voicemail and he's like, hey, I need you to call me back. I had a police officer saying, that you're involved in an accident. I know that can't be true. And so that was a very heartbreaking, firsthand account of somebody that just, we're hitting him with this powerful news, right? And he doesn't want to deal with that. The ego can't deal with this level of emotion that he's about to have to deal with, right? So the defense mechanism that was employed was simply to just refuse it. It's like, no, that didn't happen. So even if we, which of course we would do, show them pictures or anything like that, of the wreckage or whatever, despite irrefutable facts, they still say, no, that didn't happen. No, they just refuse to accept it. So this doesn't work in the long run, right? This is sort of a temporary fix. This is because when you hit somebody that doesn't have time to put their armor up, it's painful. So what this denial typically does is it gives them a few minutes to say, no, that didn't happen. And I have this mental picture of them suiting up in this emotional suit of armor, right? While they're saying, that didn't happen. And once they get fully suited up, then they want to be like, okay, hit me with that again. And then you tell them again, and now they're ready to receive that information, and they're guarded. Now they can maybe accept it and then start to work through it. But you can't just sucker punch somebody out of the blue that didn't have time to prep for it. So that's denial. Works in the short run to some extent, but certainly not. You can't stay in denial forever. The next one is regression. Regression is a reversion to an earlier stage of development in the face of unacceptable thoughts or impulses. So this is whenever somebody just acts childish. And you'll notice as we go through, I mean, some of these are very, very similar to one another, so they're very nuanced in their differences. So I don't so much care about that. But, regression is the id sort of taking over, that toddler taking over, and just sort of taking over the rules of behavior, right? The ego knows the socially acceptable ways to handle things, but sometimes anger clouds that. So even as an adult, you might give somebody the silent treatment for a while, or you might call somebody a name or something out of anger, and that's really regression, right? That's very childish behavior. However mad somebody gets, you should be able to talk it out. You should be able, if you realize that you're feeling those bad emotions, you should be able to take a time out. I need 10 minutes to collect my thoughts, right? Take some deep breaths, go punch a pillow, whatever works for you, and then come back as an adult and talk through it, right? Not everybody does that very well. So sometimes we regress and we act childish. We say things we don't mean. We do things, we punch walls, we do things like that. That's all sort of regressing to an earlier stage of developmental behavior. All right, next is acting out. Performing an extreme behavior in order to express thoughts or feelings the person feels incapable of otherwise expressing. These are your temper tantrums. It's a little bit different than regression because, again, regression doesn't always have to involve a bad temper. It can be just giving somebody the silent treatment. That's not really a temper tantrum. That's not an aggressive act. It's sort of passive aggressive, right? So regression's a little bit different than acting out, but again, there's some overlap there, a little bit of similarities. Dissociation is an interesting one. Dissociation is something that we'll talk about in the disorders chapter 15, I believe it is. This is when a person loses track of time. This DID stands for dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. So again, we'll talk about this in the disorders chapter in a little more detail, but this is a very Freudian concept, psychoanalysis concept, where basically the psyche is so damaged that it splinters and it becomes kind of an entity in and of itself. So this personality, your personality, goes into such denial that a new personality is sort of formed that is able to deal with it because they're emotionally disconnected. So for instance, that man, let's say that this was what happened with him, right? So, Ben, your wife died. Well, Ben splinters his psyche because Ben can't deal with not having that wife. So now he's Carl, and the Carl part of his personality can deal with the loss of this woman because I don't know that woman. I don't have an emotional connection to her, so I can deal with the fact that she's not here, and I can help Ben get through that. It's very controversial. A lot of people don't believe that it exists or that it's possible, and that it's sort of an acting out behavior, and that it's not happening on this unconscious level where Ben is not aware of Carl and Carl's not aware of Ben, and there is no control. It is just an acting out. It's Ben pretending to be Carl in an acting out fashion. So, again, about half the community in psychology believes it to be a possibility and to be true, although it's very rare, much more rare than what Hollywood would have you believe. I am in the camp. I don't believe it. I just don't. I think the theory is interesting, and the theory makes sense, but I don't think our brain is capable of doing that. So I personally don't believe in dissociation. I've never seen it, and I tend to not believe things that I don't see with my eyes because I'm a very cynical person. All right, projection. Projection is the misattribution of a person's undesired thoughts, feelings, or impulses onto another person. So jealousy is one of them, often caused by a lack of introspection. So we don't realize that we're feeling it, but we realize that we're feeling something negative, and we don't like that. So we want to get rid of that, so we just project it onto somebody else. So there's another one, and I'm going to skip ahead. So let's see, which one is it? Displacement. So displacement is the unconscious blocking of unacceptable thoughts, feelings, and impulses. Now, it's different from projection because projection attributes the cause to somebody else, while displacement doesn't. It just takes it out on somebody else. So we've all heard that situation where you have a bad day at work and you come home pissed off and so you kick the dog, right? Did the dog make you have a bad day? Obviously not. So that would be displacement. I am displacing my anger. I'm getting rid of it and I'm placing it onto the dog, who is an innocent bystander. By the way, if you come home and kick the dog, you suck. But that would be displacement. Now that's different than projection, because projection, you're actually attributing that negative thing that you feel to another innocent person. So this would be when you come home and you yell at the dog because the dog made you happy. You know, you made me late for work this morning because I had to take you for a walk. And if I didn't have to take you for a walk, I wouldn't have been late. And if I wasn't late, I wouldn't have missed that meeting. And if I wouldn't have missed that meeting, you know, maybe there's some truth to it, but usually in projection there's not, right? Usually, you know, you should be mad at yourself. You didn't get up early enough to take the dog out. Or, you know, traffic was bad and that's not the fault of the dog. But you're looking for someone to blame other than yourself. And so you project. This is a very common one. I see this probably one of the top 3 on this list. So again, you know, these are the more primitive ones. We don't see that all that often. Very rare cases, and it's usually a pretty big thing, like a death notice or something that brings out this level of primitiveness. So now we're starting to, I think, get into the ones that we do sort of see on a fairly regular basis, honestly. So projection's you know, we've all seen somebody that is blaming you for them having a bad day, right? So I think that it helps to understand that this person is dealing with negative emotions, that they're simply not capable. They don't have the tools in their toolbox, the coping mechanisms to deal with it. And so instead of dealing with it, because they're somewhat emotionally stunted or immature, then they're going to use one of these ego defense mechanisms. And that's a normal self-preservation tool. And so because I know that, if somebody's projecting onto me and I instantly recognize that it's projection, I don't feel anger that they're dumping on me. I feel empathy that, oh man, that really sucks that they're dealing with this issue and they're not dealing especially well with it. And instead of, you know, all the pain and hurt that they're feeling, you know, there's drowning in it. So now they're putting some of it off onto me. Well, I'm not going to fall for it. I know it's not my fault that they had a bad day. So, you know, what can I do to help that person? So that's what I really like about understanding these is, you know, you understand these defense mechanisms instead of falling victim to it and they project onto you and now you feel bad and you've become a victim of their anger. Now, you know, it's like you have that defense mechanism sort of preparedness. So whenever that happens, you recognize it, you don't take it personally, you don't get upset, and now you maybe can reach out to them and communicate and help them deal with their own emotions. So again, I just really like this chapter because of its practical use. All right, reaction formation, that's a really interesting one to me. It's definitely not something that I would I would ever gravitate to. I will tell you the ones that I'm guilty of on this list, and that it's just not one of them. This is the converting of unwanted, dangerous thoughts, feelings, or impulses onto their opposites. So I feel hatred, let's say, towards a coworker for whatever reason. Maybe they just absolutely deserve it. They're a horrible human being, right? So I know as a good Christian, I shouldn't hate anybody, right? We should love our neighbor and all that. So I'm going to just go overboard and kill them with kindness. And, you know, it's great. Sometimes it works. You know, sometimes it makes them start to really look in the mirror and realize how badly they're treating you and how good you treat them. And they realize, yeah, that's not cool. And sometimes they knock off the behavior and you gain their respect. And I'm not saying it doesn't work. I'm saying I can't do it. If somebody is you know, horrible to me, I'm going to ignore them or be horrible back. It's just how I'm wired. So I don't know how to do this kill them with kindness thing, but I have seen it, and it's interesting sometimes to see people that it's almost like they're playing into the victimization that, you know, they're being used or abused, you know, by maybe a coworker that's dumping more work onto them, and instead of saying, "I'm not doing that, that's not my job," they're like, "Oh, okay, yeah, I'll do that for you." And then, you know, they go off and they have lunch with everybody and they don't ever invite you, and you know, and you're feeling bad about that. It makes you like them less. And so, you know, then you go out of your way to maybe invite them to lunch and things like that, even though they aren't inviting you. And next thing you know, you're kissing their butt and they're treating you like crap. So I've seen this a couple of times, and it really baffles me. But I got to say, on the other hand, I'm a little bit impressed by it. I think it takes a certain kind of person to an empathetic and caring person to go towards this particular defense mechanism. All right, going right along here. So repression is the unconscious blocking of unacceptable thoughts, feelings, and by the way, I'm not going to keep saying this. Thoughts, feelings, impulses, all of these are the same, right? They all sort of are under that collective negative umbrella, and all of these defense mechanisms can be employed to deal with a thought or a feeling or an impulse. So repression is just burying it. Can we do this? This is another one of those somewhat debated, although less debated. Some people think, no, you can't really repress things. Other people say, well, absolutely you can. But how much can you repress something? So going back to this slide, can we repress it right here? Absolutely. There's no doubt. We can just stop thinking about it. We can force it out of our minds and think about other things. At any time that memory pops up above the surface, we can bump it on the head and put it back down to here. Now, can we repress something down to here? Can we repress something so far that we literally can't recall it even if we try? It's just lost forever? That's where the debate comes in. Some people argue that with very traumatic things, childhood sexual abuse, for instance, that you can repress it so far that you don't even recall it. And then suddenly it can be recalled through deep hypnosis or deep, therapy where you can dig out the details. I'm very skeptical of that. But at the same time, I've never experienced anything like that. I've never personally experienced a thing that was traumatic enough that I think it would qualify as serious trauma that would allow me to bury it down here. Now, I know that like when I was in junior high school, I was very badly picked on. I'm going to say their names. I don't care. Andy Gray, Scott Fisher, and Casey Persick. The three of those guys beat me up every day in sixth grade gym class. They took my shoes. One guy could make himself puke on command. He would puke in my shoe. They would steal my clothes. They would put them in the toilet and then pee on them. And then, what am I going to do? Wear gym clothes for the rest of the day? That was my option. So that was pretty traumatic. And I don't often think of it. I definitely buried it. I think that's the reason I pursued some of the career paths that I have. Got into martial arts and MMA and jiu-jitsu. And, I think I've taken a lot of turns in my life because of that childhood stuff. I don't remember a whole lot about my junior high school years. I can't name a single teacher that I had in 6th, 7th, or 8th grade. Not one. I don't remember. I remember a few elementary school teachers. I remember quite a few high school teachers. I had a great high school time. I kind of found my footing in high school. Had lots and lots of friends. I was involved in a lot of different things. Didn't get bullied anymore after those first 2 years of junior high school. I even ran into those guys, and it's like they didn't even remember me. I was nobody to them. And that was a powerful moment for me, too, because it taught me that it wasn't personal. They weren't beating me up because I was Daniel Hageman, and they didn't like me. They were beating me up because I was a skinny kid, and I happened to sit next to them alphabetically in the attendance lines. If I had been bigger, they probably would have left me alone. If I would have been on the other side of the gym class, it would have left me alone. But because I was in close proximity and I was, this big around and weak and uncoordinated, I was an easy target. So, when I depersonalized it, it made more sense. And I didn't feel as bad about myself. So a lot of things I don't remember about that time period is probably because I chose not to remember those terrible, terrible years. Not to mention everybody sucks at junior high school, right? That age just sucks, right? Puberty and all that, everything just about it is pretty terrible. So I had an especially hard time because of the bullying. But, I've repressed some of that stuff, but I can remember some of it. I remember their names. I remember that PE teacher's name that never stepped in to help me. He was a retired NFL football player, and he was built like a professional bodybuilder. And he was kind of more on their side than mine. But can I push that so deep that I don't even remember it happening? No. So I have a hard time wrapping my head around somebody being able to repress a thought so deep that it literally can just never be recalled. Um, but we do see people that try to repress things and forget it. All right, moving on. Displacement, I already talked about. Intellectualization. This is an interesting one. I definitely have gravitated towards this one. The overemphasis on thinking when confronted with an unacceptable impulse, situation, or behavior without employing any emotions whatsoever to help mediate and place the thoughts in an emotional human context. Best example of this I can think of. So I was married for 11 years, and my ex-wife was a Bible thumping, holy rolling, no boyfriends before me. I was her first everything for the most part. And I wasn't technically, but yeah, it's not important. So we're selected as a mentor couple at our church. Just literally, you guys are doing everything right. We want y'all to mentor other new couples. So we agreed, and we went through the workshop, and then we became trainers, and we're training new couples. And one of the week's sessions was about um, confessing your sins to your spouse. Should you or shouldn't you? What should you keep from them? And it's just between you and God. And what should you tell to them? And whatever. I'm not nearly as religious as she was, so admittedly, a lot of it I was just kind of rolling along. So we're driving home from that, and she tells me, "Do you think that we should confess?" And I was like, "I don't know. I guess it depends on what you're talking about. I mean, it's kind of hard to give a blanket answer to that. It depends on the situation." And she said, "Well, I have a confession." And I was like, "Okay, what?" And here I am thinking, like, she's a saint. Her confession is going to be like, "I spent $20 or some stupid thing," right? And she said, "I've been talking to another guy." What? No clue, no indicators whatsoever that anything like that would have happened. So I was like, okay, I need the details. So what happened was, the short version of the story is what happened was she had gotten into woodworking and had built a cabinet just out of boredom. She was a stay-at-home mom, so she had a lot of time. So I had all the tools. So she came across this woman that lives in Alaska that builds furniture, and the frontier woman or something, and made it look easy. So she did. So, and it came out really well. So one of her girlfriends saw it and bought it, and then next thing you know, her connections wanted her to build end tables and all these. So she becomes a carpenter and has a little business. And it was actually taking off. She was sold several pieces, and people were liking this custom furniture that was really cheap. And so she showed me a piece, and again, she has no training in this, and I had a little bit. My father was a carpenter for a while, and I picked up a few things. So I was like, hey. And I said it quickly. I was like, "Hey, this is good, but here's what I would do. I would change, and I would kind of chamfer this edge over to this side, and I would do this, and that you don't see the seam in between these two." And I was giving her constructive advice. I thought that was probably relevant, considering she's selling this, and I want her to have the best product possible. Well, she didn't take it that way. She was offended that I critiqued it instead of just praised it. And so she went to the gym that day with our kids, who were at the time were like 2 and 4, and was at the pool with them. And some guy hits on her and says, and they get to talking, and she said that she owned a business, and he was impressed, and he wanted to see pictures. And so the next thing you know, she's saying, "Oh, here's my Facebook page. I have pictures of my work." So he gets on her Facebook page. Now they're messaging back and forth. And one day she's at the park with the kids, and and we had our issues. I mean, we weren't, on the surface we might look like that mentor couple, but we definitely had some issues. So he says, "Hey, what are you up to?" And she said, "I'm at the park." And he says, "Can I join you?" And she says, "Okay, sure." And again, maybe thinking that she's sort of being innocent, hasn't done anything. This happens 4 times, and the next thing he kisses her, and she kisses him back, and an affair is born. So she tells me this, and again, I am absolutely clueless. I've never checked her phone. I've never checked her email. I just wasn't in the habit of doing that. I was not a jealous person at all, and I had no reason not to trust her at that point. And so I just couldn't wrap my head around the fact that this had happened. And so I needed answers. And so immediately, like literally as she's telling me, I'm already excusing it and trying to figure out why. That's what was important. Not what she did, but why she did it. That's all I could think about. And she had been on a mood stabilizing medication, and that mood stabilizing medication is which one was it? I can't think of the name of it. I'll think of it in a second. But Lexapro. She was on something called Lexapro, and she needed that to stabilize her moods. She kind of would have pretty bad mood swings and had a little bit of depression to go along with it. So this really evened her out. Well, I was between jobs and I lost our insurance, and so she went to refill it, and it was like $150 for like a month. And she went, "Oh, can't afford that, so I guess I'm done with that med." So she just quit cold turkey. But you can't quit that kind of med cold turkey. It's really bad for you. It messes you up emotionally. So you have to wean off of it. And she didn't know that. She didn't do that. She was afraid to tell me about that because she didn't want me to feel guilty about not having the insurance. And so she just quit cold turkey. And as soon as I put that together, that the time frame is this happened right after she stopped with the meds, I was like, oh, well, that's why it happened. Yeah. So you stopped taking the meds and it made your moods all out of whack. And that's the reason that you acted uncharacteristically and made these uncharacteristically bad choices. And that's what happened. So all we need to do is get you back on your meds and then you're fine. And by the way, don't ever talk to that guy again. And yeah, we're good. Everything's good. Yeah, we're fine. So that was me intellectualizing the inability to control the emotion that was, being blindsided, by this information. So, I probably could come up with other examples, maybe less personal, but, hey, you talk about what you know, right? So intellectualization is something that I have to be very careful of because when you know a lot of things, you tend to gravitate towards that particular defense mechanism, right? You want an explanation as to why something happened, and then you tend to come up with a theory that is pretty sound, and so you forgive it. And you don't deal with the emotion. You don't deal with the fact that that person wronged you or treated you badly or whatever. So, it's good to understand why, but it is also an important aspect to properly navigate those emotions and not just, intellectualize them away. So that's something that I have to work on. All right, rationalization, we've probably all heard of this. This is when you just spin something into a different light. I know a lot of people that went and bought Xboxes whenever they all of a sudden were told that they were going to stay home and work from home because they're like, well, no, I have time to play. Well, theoretically, no. Theoretically, you spent 40 hours at work and you weren't able to play Xbox, and now you should be spending 40 hours at work even though you're on your computer, but you're still not on Xbox, right? But they rationalize, well, I'm going to be home more often, so I should get an Xbox. But the only thing you saved is your commute. Other than that, your time really shouldn't be that much different. So rationalization is just spinning it into a different light to where you can kind of convince yourself that it is an appropriate thing because the ego really knows this is not appropriate, right? I'm just giving in to the id, and I know I shouldn't, but I'm going to, and here's why. And it gives you a positive reason, even though it's sort of manufactured, right? Undoing is the attempt to take back an unconscious behavior or thought that's unacceptable or hurtful. So this is, one of my favorite lessons for my kids was, when they were old enough to talk, they were already at each other's throats about most things because they're both highly competitive. And so sometimes they would say things to each other that I was not a fan of. They're just not very nice. And, I try to teach them that words hurt and they matter and all that. And, especially whenever you're very young and immature, you could say something mean about a person and then turn around and go, well, I take it back. Well, that's not how it works, right? I mean, we all know that. If I roasted you from head to toe about your looks and then calmed down and 30 seconds later and went, okay, well, I didn't mean that, sorry. Would that take the pain away? Or would you still be very self-conscious about how you look because I bashed you from head to toe? So, trying to teach this lesson. So there's the old toothpaste lesson, right? So I got a plate and I got a tube of toothpaste and I had said, okay, pretend that the toothpaste are your words. All right. So I want you to just spew out all your words all over this plate. Of course, kids love that, right? They're making a mess. So they empty out the entire tube of toothpaste or whatever. And I'm like, okay, so this is all of your words on the plate, all right? Now I want you to take it back. I want you to put all that toothpaste back in the bottle. And you're not getting up from the table until you do. And they're like, excuse me? And you're like, yeah, these are your words. I want you to just take them back. I want you to put them back where they came from. And, and there'll be no more mess. And that plate needs to be completely clean like it was whenever we started. And so they spend, I'm torturing them for like 10, 15 minutes, making them take their finger and try to push it back into the tube or whatever. And they're crying because it can't be done. And you're telling them they're not going to get up until their words have been taken back. And then they realize, it doesn't work like that. You can't take those words back. The damage is done, the mess is made, and it can't be unmade. Anyway, I read that somewhere. I didn't come up with that. I read that somewhere, and I thought it sounded fun. So I tried it, and I thought whatever. And God, it was like 2 or 3 years later. They were bickering about something, and I got onto them, and I think it was my son. My son was like, "Yeah, it's like the toothpaste. Can't take it back." And he like caught himself and said that. And it was such a proud parent moment, right? Where you're like, oh my God, I did a lesson and it stuck and planted a seed and it grew for all these years and it came back out and it freaking worked. It was awesome. So, anyway, undoing is just, knowing that you've hurt somebody and you, in your mind, you feel guilty and ashamed that you've done that. And so you just say, I take it back. Something that simple, right? That's undoing. All right, last couple of them here. Sublimation is the channeling of unacceptable impulse thoughts and emotions into more acceptable ones. These are people that, have bad days or they're mad at their spouse or whatever, and so they go for a run or they go to the gym and they take it out on the weights or they have a punching bag in their garage and they come back in with bloody knuckles. Those are the more aggressive ones. Less aggressive are, they're miserable with life, so they just daydream a much better life. That's called sublimation. You can't deal with the reality right now, and so you channel that energy, the negative energy, you convert it into something that's more positive. That's not a terrible one. Remember I said as this list goes down, they get better and better because, think about it, all of these are pretty destructive. They're all self-destructive, right? Because they're not properly dealing with anything, but projecting onto somebody else, you're victimizing that person. Reaction formation, you're being nice to them, even though you actually hate them. That's not particularly a good thing. Displacement, again, you're victimizing somebody else. Repression, you're sort of victimizing yourself because you're burying it so deep. Now you're going to have other issues, and you don't even know why because you've buried this in your unconscious. So all of these are bad because you're victimizing somebody else or you're victimizing yourself. Now we start to get a little bit into the ones where you're not really victimizing anybody. Not as bad, right? So the sublimation one, now we're starting to get into sort of the somewhat more positive ones. Compensation, this is just psychologically counterbalancing perceived weaknesses by emphasizing strengths. So, I know I'm not good working with teams, for instance. I'm much more of an individual. And so I work in a job where I need to do both. I need to be really good working with the teams because I can't do everything by myself. But I also need to be really strong individually to pull, my weight here where nobody else can do those things. But I know I'm not particularly good at the team thing. So I just double my efforts on the individual side of things to where, my work is so good that my bosses go, well, he's not a great team player, but he's really good at all this other stuff. So, we're okay that that's a weakness over here. That's probably a crappy example, but just, compensating, it just means that you're going to focus on those things that you do well. All right, maybe you're really good at communicating. Right? I feel like I'm a particularly good communicator. So, my son will do something, he'll step out of line or whatever, sometimes my daughter, and I will sit them down and we will talk it out. And, I'll get their perspective, I will give them my perspective, I will explain what they did that I didn't really care for, what the consequences are, what are some alternative behaviors that could have happened. We hug it out and, everybody moves forward after that point. So I'm really good with the communication part. I'm not so good with the emotional part. I mentioned that before. Sometimes my son will do something that's just really boneheaded and I will just be like, really? And I'll like really get after him. And then I kind of realize, that was a little much. Like I should have taken a deep breath before I opened my mouth, right? And so I have to sit down and go, hey, look, I'm sorry that I snapped at you, all right? But, it really it really bothers me that we've talked about this before and you did it anyway, and it makes me think that, you just don't care, you don't have any respect, whatever the conversation is, right? But I'll have to over communicate sometimes because my emotional intelligence is a little on the lower end that I wish it was. And so, that's compensation. I feel bad about the inability to control that emotional outburst. And so I have to sort of compensate for that with the outpouring of love and communication and all that. So I don't feel like I did any psychological damage to him for snapping at him like I did. All right. Assertiveness. I'm going to skip that one. Don't worry about that one. I want to get to this humor one and get done with this section. So humor is reducing the tension of a situation by employing a non-congruent perspective. Now, this is what I wrote my dissertation on, by the way. This is my particular field of expertise, and I wish I could teach a whole class on the humor of psychology, but it'll never happen probably. So there's... Back when I did my dissertation, there were four, it was kind of generally agreed upon, there were four distinctive humor types, and that's what's listed here. There was aggressive humor, which is like sarcasm where you're putting somebody down. Somebody is the butt of the joke, right? It's a very aggressive form of humor. Then there's self-deprecating humor, which is, again, very aggressive, but it's making yourself the butt of the joke. And then there's the less aggressive types. There's the self-affiliative humor, which is used to enhance one's relationships. Well, it's kind of a team-building humor. I want to lighten the tension in the room, and I want to say something. There is no butt of the joke. I just say something that's maybe incongruent with what you expected for me to say, and everybody laughs, and we all bond over that. And then there's the self-enhancing humor, and that's used to enhance the self in a benevolent, positive manner. And it's very similar, but it's less group building and more like personal. So anyway, these have kind of been updated, honestly, in the last couple of years, and now these have been expanded on. So now these are four very broad categories, and I think now the newer research really kind of looks like there's about 8. And they're broken down. They break some of these down into 2 different kinds of aggressive humor, kind of, for instance. And then there's a lot more positive ones that are not listed here. What's interesting to me about this and what I wanted to point out, I've looked through a lot of Freud's works on defense mechanisms, and he goes into, think of the detail that I've gone into, and, Freud wrote basically books about every one of these, right? So tons and tons and tons of detail. The only thing that I could find is that he did list humor as a defense mechanism. And what he said is the right kind of humor is the only defense mechanism where there is no victim. You're not victimizing yourself, like in repression, for instance. You're sort of causing emotional damage by not dealing with that properly. And there's no victim on the outside. So humor is like the perfect defense mechanism because it allows you to deal with a situation by simply turning it on its head. And the best example I can give of this is I came across this when I was doing my research for my book. But there was a soldier in Afghanistan. His Humvee hit an IED, which, if you don't know, is an explosive device, and it blew the Hummer completely over, killed everybody inside except him. And he lost his legs. And when he came to, there were other members of his platoon that were all around his bed. And they were saying, nobody said anything. It was just silent. And he looked around, and he saw all this tension, everybody looking at him. And, nobody knew what to say. So it was just, could hear a pin drop. And he looked down, and he realized at that moment he didn't have any legs. And, he's got to deal with this situation. He's got to deal with this situation. And so what he chose to do was to say, thank God. And everybody in the platoon is like looking around like, oh my God, is he in shock? Does he not know what's going on? Like, what is he saying thank God for? And he goes, no, you guys don't understand. As soon as I got back from this tour, my girlfriend had signed us up for salsa dancing lessons. And now I don't have to go. And everybody kind of laughed. And the tension was broken. And he built this camaraderie around, hey, you know what, guys? We're going to get through this. I'm going to get through this. Life is going to be different, but at least I'm alive, right? So he's looking at the positive. He's dealing with it. Everybody in the room tensions were lowered. I mean, their feeling of inadequacy for, they're fully alive and he's, all this damage to his body, that kind of dissolved because he allowed for that to happen. So, I mean, it just solved everything. And I'm sure when everybody left the room and he was alone to his own thoughts, I'm sure he probably cried it out. But, that use of humor let him deal with that horribly negative emotional feeling that was going on, and everybody kind of won. And it's interesting to me that Freud names it as being the most powerful of all of them, but he did no further writing about it. He didn't write a book about it. He didn't write an excerpt in a book about it. He just mentioned it. I literally found it in like 2 sentences in one of his books about how great it is, and then he never talks about it again. And I think that's the reason that people don't study humor, is because they feel like as a doctor you need to treat what's wrong. You need to diagnose what's wrong. You need to gravitate towards what's broken and work on fixing it. And if humor is like the perfect solution, well, then there's no research to be done. Like, we just know, yeah, that's great. There's lots of research to be done, so it just wasn't done. And the other reason is I think people don't take it seriously. People are afraid their research on humor won't be taken seriously. They'll think, oh yeah, well, that guy's writing about funny stuff. Science is humorless, unfortunately. So anyway, it's unfortunate that this isn't talked about more, but it was kind of my thought. And if I ever get into like a full-time teaching position, this will definitely be something that I'm going to pursue, further research in. So, be looking out for that. But if you're ever going to go to grad school and you want to do a thesis or anything, reach out to me, look me up, reach out to me, and I got plenty of ideas about how humor should be studied within the field of psychology. It's much more interesting than I think some of the fields that are chosen. All right, so that's Freud in a nutshell. That's, I think, his most famous theory is the id, ego, and superego, kind of how it breaks down these defense mechanisms, why they're employed, how they're employed, kind of what they do. So that's I know that's a lot of material. I'm going to keep on plugging away. We're going to go into his next thing. This was very well known, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on it because nobody uses this anymore. This is more for historical reference, so I'm just going to go through this. This is also covered in the lifespan chapter coming up. So again, we'll talk about it now since we're already Freud heavy. But I think this really kind of has a better place in the developmental chapter. So, Freud didn't just have explanations as to our personality. Freud also sought to bring order to the chaos that was the field of psychology, right? Like, how do we develop? Why do we act the way that we act? Why do we think the way that we think? There was a lot of unknowns, right? And he wanted to sort of organize and have at least a theory on most of those things. So how we develop from infancy to adulthood was something that he also was known for. And this is these are, I guess I should say, the stages of psychosexual development. Now, here's a trick question that I'm probably going to ask on the tests that I'll give you. So Freud said that there were 4 stages, all right? And the 4 stages that Freud said existed were the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage, and then he said everything goes on pause for a little while, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then we kind of unpause, and we have that 4th stage, which is the genital stage. After this was out and being talked about, people didn't like that there was that pause and there was nothing there. So people assigned that period of time its own stage, and they called it the latency stage. But Freud did not believe that that was a stage. So Freud has 4 stages of psychosexual development. But what you'll see often in textbooks is the 5 stages of Freud's psychosexual development. And Freud actually spoke on that and said, no, there are not 5 stages. There are 4. There are 3 distinct stages. Then there is a distinct period where nothing happens. That's not a stage. And then we have another stage. And I think people misunderstand that from a historical perspective. So anyways, fun fact. But let me go through them real quick. So the first stage of psychosexual development, now remember we talked about libido. right? Libido is that sexual driving energy, right? So this is present from birth. And I know it's hard to wrap your brain around some sexual energy in a 1-year-old, 6-month-old, right? But just because they're not sexually mature doesn't mean that they don't have the sexual energy. They're not physically capable of acting on it, but they still have that energy. Because remember, energy cannot be created nor destroyed. So if we have that energy at puberty, we had it at birth. It was just something else. Okay, so that's an important concept to remember. So that energy has a focal point, right? Now, our genitals are not fully capable of sexual maturation, right? We're not capable of procreation or using our genitals for procreation at that early stage. So where is the libido focused? Well, Freud looked at stages of development and he looked at babies. And what do babies do? They put everything in their mouth, right? Babies put their hands in their mouth, their feet in their mouth. If they find a bug on the floor, they're probably going to put it in their mouth, right? So Freud said that their libido focus was their mouth. That was one of their senses that was the most highly developed. And so he called from birth to the first year the oral stage of development. The libido focus being the mouth. And the way that we sort of go past this stage and get into the second stage was that we wean off of this. Okay, we stop putting so much things in our mouth. We take away pacifiers. We stop going to bottle, and we start to have more like hard food, not hard, but like soft foods or whatever, baby food. So we wean away from that. If we don't properly wean, or we don't wean at the proper time, if the timing is off or the focus is off, then we will have a fixation for the rest of our lives. Okay? So what you'll see is people that overeat because they have an oral fixation. You ever seen somebody that always has something in their mouth? They always have a pin in their mouth. They have their hair pulled across their mouth and they're chewing on their hair. They're biting on their knuckles. Freud would say that that person has an oral fixation, and it's because they received kind of an overabundance of pleasure from this mouth libido focus, and they weren't properly weaned away from that. They didn't transfer from this phase to the next phase very well, and so they sort of stayed in this oral phase, and it's their whole life. Now it goes from, when you're a baby, the oral thing, maybe breastfeeding, and that you such pleasure from, the sustenance that you get through the process of sucking, that you're chewing on pins as an adult, and you're probably not going to make that connection that, you're not chewing on a pin and thinking, man, I sure miss breastfeeding, right? It's not like a conscious thing. It's a subconscious thing. But Freud was able to sort of figure this out, right? Now, the next phase is the anal phase. This goes from 1 to 3. And now our libido focuses from changes from our mouth, where we receive a lot of pleasure, right? Learning the world around us, to our rectum. I know, sounds weird, right? Why? Well, these are the potty training years. This is where so at this point, where, first words are coming out, we're starting to communicate a little bit, we're able to sort of put our thoughts out to the world and have them returned back to us. We can say, I want something, and then we can receive that thing. So this communication is new to this particular stage of development. We're able to move around a little bit more, right? Birth to 1, there's not a lot of mobility there, but from 1 to 3, we're maybe even up and walking by now, certainly crawling. So our whole world is completely changed, right? So we don't really rely on the mouth as much. Our world got bigger. And so now potty training is the next big thing, right? Getting away from diapers, learning how to properly use the restroom, and we're praised when we do it right? And that's a good feeling. So Freud says that this anal stage is sort of focused on the potty training, is the major development that happens there. And what happens if this is not properly navigated? Well, you can become anal retentive, which is somebody who's like overly orderly, right? It's kind of your OCD type thing, right? All your ducks in a row, everything nice and neat, and everything needs to be clean and all that. Freud says that this stems all the way back to potty training, right? Your sense of wearing a dirty diaper and getting that off of you and being clean and using the little potty properly and everything and then being clean, that stayed with you for life. Now the opposite of that is somebody who is not anal retentive but anal expulsive, and that's somebody that's super messy. They're just a slob, right? Their desk is a mess, their room is a mess, their car is a mess. They're just messy, messy, messy because again, this potty training was not properly navigated, and that being in a messy diaper and being cared for while being messy was somehow a focus of this libido focus, and it brought pleasure. And then that didn't get properly navigated to the next stage, and so it stayed that way all the way into adulthood. Now, again, I'm going to just reiterate here. You're not going to go to a pediatrician that's going to talk to you about this stuff. All right, you're not going to go to a psychologist that's going to probably talk to you about this stuff. I don't think anything in here is particularly used today. So this is really, again, just for historical reference for the most part. So we have our oral stage, we have our anal stage. The next stage, according to Freud, is our phallic stage. From 3 to 6, that's when we discover genitals. Now, this happens twice, as you can see. When we skip to the genital stage, right, we have, again, the libido focus is genitals, and then it goes away, and then it comes back. Well, the reason that it's here is because we become aware of our body. From 3 to 6, I got fingers, toes, legs, arms, and I got boy parts, right? Or I have girl parts, especially if you have opposite sex in the same house. If you have a brother and sister, and maybe they bathe together, at some point they say, hey, how come their parts look different than my parts, right? And now you have some splaining to do. So that period is the discovery of genitals, and it's not for use. It's not, I have genitals and I'm going to use them, right? Because this is well before puberty happens. This is simply they exist, that it's there, right? So this phallic phase is different from the genital phase, not in the libido focus, but mostly in the major development. Now, this is one of Freud's most famous theories that he's sort of roasted about. I'm just going to tell you what it is. Here's the story if you want to read it. So basically, there was a play written in like 500 years before Christ, right? Written by Sophocles, called Oedipus the King. Basically, the story goes like this. Oedipus was foretold by the Oracle of Delphi that he was going to be killed by, wait, did I say this right? Oedipus was foretold to kill his father. That's what it was. So the father was told Oedipus is going to kill you. So he cast away his son and disowned him and pretended he didn't exist, and he just went off into the world, and that was it. Years and years later, that son is on a road, and it's a narrow road, and there's a chariot coming his way, and both drivers, I guess, he was on a horse, both say, hey, I was here first, get out of my way, I'm not going to go around, and there's not room for us to pass each other, and both said, no, I'm not going to move, you move, and so he drew his sword and fought and killed everybody in the chariot. And we're talking about road rage, right? This is like road rage before roads. This is like horse rage or whatever you call it. So anyway, so he does that, and he continues on. He goes to town. Gets to town and realizes that they're without a king, and there is a monster attacking the city. And the monster is the Sphinx, and says, I will give you a riddle, and if you can answer it, I will leave forever, and if not, I will kill you. And Oedipus is a smart guy, and he goes, all right, I'll take it. What's your riddle? And the riddle is, what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs in the evening? And he thinks about it, and he says, man, 4 legs in the morning of our lives when we're crawling, 2 legs in the afternoon of our lives when we're just walking, and then 3 legs in the twilight of our lives when we have the assistance of a cane. The Sphinx says, dude, you're sharp, I'm out, and he leaves, and the city of Thebes is so impressed that they make him the king. And so he automatically inherits the sitting queen, and that becomes his wife, and they have 4 children, I think 4 children together, something like that. And I guess somewhere down the line, he goes, hey, by the way, whatever happened to the king before me? And she says, oh, he was killed on a road by some stranger that failed to yield the right-of-way. And he realized, oh, wait, that was me. And then he's like, wait, that was that was my father. So anyway, he realizes that he unknowingly killed his father in that road rage situation, and that means he is now married to his mother. And he didn't know that, and he had 4 children with her. So everybody goes crazy. What was the ending here? He killed the king, and his new bride was actually his mother. He gouged out his eyes, and he lived in exile, and she hung herself. And I think 2 of the kids killed themselves, and then 2 of the other ones like went crazy. And this was considered a good play at the time. Like, talk about a Greek tragedy, right? It was like kind of weird. Who thinks of that kind of stuff, right? Crazy. So, how does any of that apply to Freud? Freud has what he called the Oedipus complex. Freud believed that a boy, when they reach this phallic stage, right, they start to realize that there is a difference between boys and girls, right? Physically, they realize that there's a difference. They start to become attracted to their mother. They start to become romantically attracted to their mother because that's what they see, right? Mom and dad are romantically linked. Mom is a female. I'm a boy. Dad is a boy. I need to do what my dad does. I need to give my mom what my dad gives her. I want to grow up and be like that. I want to be an adult. I want to be like my dad. So he grows up to compete with dad for mom's affection. Freud called this the Oedipus complex, where we fall in love with our mothers, and then over time we start to realize that there is a difference between romantic love and familial love, right? Love you have for your parent is not the same as the love that you have for your spouse or the love you have for your child, for instance. So all of these are different kinds of love, which is sort of a complicated thing, and we don't learn that until later on. So that being the case, we sort of resolve this Oedipus complex on our own, hopefully, and we move past it. Now, again, things can go wrong in just about anything that there is a plan for, right? So if this is the plan, is that ultimately we resolve this. Some people out there don't properly resolve it, right? They don't really ever get past it. They're mama's boys, and they're sort of secretly in love with their mom for the rest of their lives. Or they have kind of an unnatural, actual sexual attraction that lasts after puberty, that's unresolved. So again, you can imagine this is something that was not well received by people in Freud's time. Probably wouldn't be well received now. So this Oedipus complex was highly controversial, still is. A lot of people don't believe it. A lot of people don't understand it. Now there is an antithesis to this, all right, and it's called the Electra complex, and it's little girls that fall in love with their dads and kind of shun their mothers for a time. Now, this was not a Freudian concept. Here's fun fact number 2. This was not a Freudian concept. In fact, Freud said that doesn't happen. He was adamantly against this. There was a follower of Freud named Carl Jung, who is super famous, by the way. We'll talk about him another time. And he is the one that said the Electra complex, if it happens for boys, it happens for girls. Freud disagreed with that. He said that girls develop what he called penis envy. They're jealous of the power possessed by owners of penises. Is that a word? Penises? I can't believe I'm saying this many times in a video. But yeah, so girls develop penis envy, and they wish that they had one, and they wish that they had all of the power and respect that's commanded because you have one, and that's what they deal with. Boys already have that, so they don't have to worry about that. They're just trying to figure out how to properly use it and who to use it on, right? So they have very different psychological sort of crisis that they're dealing with in those developmental years. But he did not believe that the Electra complex existed, so that's not a Freudian thing. All right, back to our chart. So, oral stage, mouth, anal stage, rectum, potty training. Then we go to the phallic stage where we realize the genitals. We have this Oedipus complex where we fall in love with our mother, and then we realize, oh, nope, that's the wrong kind of love. That's not what I'm going for there. There's different kinds of love, and we properly navigate that. And then, right around the end of 6 years, right, we start to become more social because, again, our schooling starts roughly around there, right? 5, 6 years old. So at this point, our emphasis is off of ourselves. Everything here has been the emphasis is on us, right? My focus is putting things in my mouth. That brings me a lot of pleasure. And then, once I can move around and my world gets a little bigger, well, now potty training is like this huge different thing, right? I've been eating for a while. Nothing else has really changed that much except my world got bigger. So the next big thing that I got to navigate is this potty training. So that's my focus. The next thing after that is I start to realize, oh, I have different parts than my sister. So I realize this, and I have this whole Oedipus complex, or if you want to go that route, Electra complex. And now I'm dealing with emotions and feelings of love and belonging and all of that. And if this is not properly navigated, sexual deviancy. So, you've seen like your Norman Bates, right? And he had this Oedipus complex towards his mother, or his mother, like he was in love with, and all that kind of stuff. And never really kind of got past that. He was a mama's boy and he killed people and all that kind of stuff. He was a sexual deviant. So that's a Hollywood example, but an example nonetheless. So according to Freud, at this point, we put all of this stuff on pause, and our libido focus sort of turns to a more societal thing. We start to take more attention to making friends and fitting in and learning our place. And this is where we're really starting to build our superego. So remember that rule book that's got all these different rules? Well, one of the places we get rules about what is acceptable behavior is through our peers. Interaction with our friends, and we learn what we can do and what we can't do and what we should do and what we shouldn't do and what works and what doesn't work and what gets us friends and what pisses those friends off. And so we're focused on our superego at this point, and so we don't really have a libido focus. Our focus is more psychosocial here and not psychosexual until we hit puberty. And by the way, this is where we learn our defense mechanisms, starting around 6. And that's when you see the primitive ones, the denial and the repression and the acting out. That's part of the reason that you see those, is because this is a very immature period of time. But then once we get to 12, we've gained quite a bit more maturity, and we're starting to see some of the ones further down on that list. And we don't have any fixations here. Now, around 12-ish, puberty kicks in. Well, that changes the game. Now we go back, we have the sexual energy fueled with hormones. Sexual energy fueled with hormones is a totally different animal, right? So now we go back to the genitals. Now we have that sexual maturation, right? We have self-gratification years are right about this time or whatever. We start to understand sex. We start to understand sexual romantic love and attraction. We start to pursue it. And so the genitals becomes our libido focus, and it pretty much stays that way for like the rest of your life. And, we learn sexual maturity. So this is kind of in a nutshell Freud's psychosexual development. Oral, anal, phallic, no stage called latency, and then genital. All right, again, historical reference only. All right, so I mentioned Neo-Freudians earlier. Neo-Freudians are people that pretty much bought what he was selling, but just did not like the sex stuff, so they got away from the untestable. Remember, that's another thing we talked about. Behaviorists observe everything, and it's observable, therefore testable, follows a scientific method. None of Freud's stuff can be tested. It's all theory. It's all psychological theory, almost philosophical. So there's anecdotal evidence where the case studies, right? You have those, and then some of that can be generalized to somebody else, and perhaps oh yeah, that's the same reason that I'm the way that I am. All right, so some of it is generalizable. So there's anecdotal evidence, but not scientific evidence, because again, it can't be observed. So we had some Neo-Freudians that were trying to bring some testability to it, and they were trying to desexualize a lot of it. And so of note, you had Alfred Adler. He was a big name in the Neo-Freudian movement. He came up with the inferiority complex. These are your people that are 5'2" and put lift kits on their trucks with the biggest tires that you can get, because they have an inferiority complex. They are of small stature physically, so they have giant cars. That's just one example, right, of the inferiority complex. I know that one of my supervisors at work is he's 5 feet tall. He's a little bitty guy, and all he ever talks about is MMA. MMA. Oh yeah, I do MMA. All that kind of stuff. So being a practitioner myself, went to the gym, invited him. He wouldn't go for the longest time. He wouldn't go. Shows up one day. He's terrible. It's like he's never, no technique at all, none. And I'm like, oh my God, that's all he ever taught. He acts like, he should be in the UFC. And it's like he has no training whatsoever. Inferiority complex. Dude, the dude's 5 foot tall, right? As a guy in our society, it's kind of frowned upon to be short. I don't know why, it just is. So what does he do? He overcompensates actually, by talking about how masculine, how tough he is, how he learned this move and that move, and frankly, he doesn't know anything. So, that's, in a nutshell, that's inferiority complex. He did a lot of work on birth order, talking about like the younger sibling is going to act like this, and then the older middle siblings are going to act like these. Very distinctive personalities between first, second, third born children. And then he talked about overcompensation, which again is big truck, little guy. Carl Jung, very big name. I think he's a little bit more of a philosopher to some extent. He talked about archetypes, different kinds of people that exist all the way back to like Greek literature, and that we, based on personality types, heroes and villains and things like that. So it's kind of interesting from a historical sort of English literature perspective. Talked a lot about introversion and extroversion, which we're going to get to in a minute. And another big notion that he has is called the collective unconscious. He thought it was interesting that, we're, no matter what culture, right, around the same time we start talking. It doesn't matter if you're Asian or American or South American or whatever. Everywhere in the world, babies start talking at a certain age. And that's interesting that we're wired that way. And that also there are things that we pick up on that we just instinctively know, right? Fire is hot, we need shelter, food goes in your mouth, you chew, you swallow, you stay alive, we need water. I mean, things like that, like they're not necessarily taught, we just kind of know. He said kind of what happens is there's this thing called the collective unconscious. It's like this repository of knowledge that just sort of exists in the universe that's kind of in our DNA, and when we're born, we just kind of know that. And like when we live and we gain all these memories and then we die and we sort of deposit these memories into this, the ether of the universe, and then the next generation that's born, it's just part of their knowledge. Like they just have this, so it's passed on from generation to generation. So again, very philosophical, very, very deep, very interesting reading, by the way. He was a pretty interesting psychologist that I wish he fit into the chapter a little bit better, but doesn't go into a lot of detail with him. But if you're interested, he'd be a good person to read the Wikipedia page about. And the last one is Karen Horney. She rejected Freud's Oedipus theory, no big surprise. She believed that people cope with anxiety through moving toward, away, or against other people. That was like your three options. Like you either hit that head on and you move toward the problem, or you're not a confrontational person and you run away from them. So there's a couple different options for you. She had some interesting theories about that, but obviously being a female at a time that there weren't a lot of females in that field, she really stood out and kind of made a name for herself. All right. A couple different perspectives in regards to personality. The humanist movement, which we've talked about with Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow being the two big names in this field. This was really the third force behind behaviorism, and remember those first ones, the structuralism, the functionalism, those are gone. Those don't even exist anymore. And then behaviorism came along, and that was psychology for a while with your Watson and Skinner. Well, then Freud came along with psychodynamic theory, and then they were two very different competing fields, and you either believed in behaviorism or you believed in psychodynamic, but you didn't necessarily walk in both worlds because they're vastly different. And then the humanist movement came along, and they weren't really a lot of either. They were kind of a little bit of both, and they were distinctive unto themselves, and they believed that people were too individualized to really have hard and fast rules across the board about all people, and they really looked at those positive qualities, the strengths, instead of focusing so much on the negatives. So, given the zeitgeist of the time with sort of the hippie peace, love, and all that kind of stuff that was going on, it really fit into that sort of mentality, and it really just took off, and it became like a very powerful driving force for psychology for a couple of years, for a great number of years actually. Carl Rogers he proposed the notion of the ideal self being that person that we really want to be versus the real self, which is the person that we actually are. And what happens is, some of us set very lofty goals and we want to be this person, but we're only this person. And the fact that we're not as good as we want causes us anxiety, stress, negative emotions. You want to look in the mirror and have that perfect 8-pack and, a certain amount of muscle tone and all that. And you look at me and you don't have that, you let yourself down. But maybe you have a pretty decent 6-pack and pretty decent physique, definitely in the top 2% of, what's walking around in America these days. But you're still not happy about that. Like, that's an issue, right? Maybe you're setting your goals just a little too high, right? But the reverse could be true, right? You could be setting very low goals for yourself, right? So your real self is here and your ideal self is pretty much here, but you should be thinking there. So, these spectrums of who we are versus who we should be, get in the way a lot. And so that was a pretty big notion at the time to identify that and be able to fix that. Congruence occurs when our ideal self and our real self are very similar. That just makes sense. Abraham Maslow, I mentioned before, he's the one with the pyramid with the self-actualization on top and all the other needs below it that had to be met. I think we've already talked about him. So just know those two names, Rogers and Maslow, are both the humanists. All right, let's talk about trait theories. This chapter's so long. Trait theories. A trait is a characteristic way of behaving. All right, so we all have different traits. Some positive traits, some not necessarily positive traits, but it is a very distinctive way of behaving, right? So a man named Gordon Allport, another fairly big name in psychology, he claimed that each person inherits a unique set of raw materials for given traits that's shaped by their experiences. So some people have what's called cardinal traits, and a cardinal trait is just central to their life. Their life is built around that trait, and it's a very strong trait. So this is people like Einstein, obviously known for his intellect. I just picked Will Ferrell. Obviously, his trait is humor, right? So he has built his whole life around his sense of humor. Became a movie star. Pursued a career that he could show off his natural talent for humor, and he's been very successful with that. It's not very common. Not everybody has a trait that is just so bright and shining that it just outshines every other trait that you have, right? We all have multiple traits, but some people just have that one trait that is just amazing. Maybe it's athleticism, maybe it's, typically I like to stick more to behavior, so athleticism might not be the best example, but just say, we have one trait that is just so, maybe empathy is just such a powerful trait for you that you decide I'm going to be a doctor, and then you go on and you're not just a doctor, but you're like a Doctors Without Borders or a Greenpeace doctor. Or you're one of the doctors that's not even making any money, but you're traveling the world really treating people that need help. That is an empathy trait, that caringness trait that most people don't have. Most people that are going to go through all the training to be a doctor, they're going to go make some money, right? And for you to do all that training and then to go live in basically poverty so that you can help people, that is a cardinal trait, and it's very uncommon. A lot of people don't have that. So cardinal traits are kind of the exception, and then you have what he called central traits. Central traits are just general characteristics, and then you have secondary traits, which are, again, infrequent general characteristics. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail with his trait theories, but sort of set the stage talking about personality, right? So So Freud sort of developed the notion of personality and really put it on the map, and then it just kind of everybody followed that for the longest time. And now you have Gordon Allport coming along, and he's proposing kind of a different series of theories, right? That all came together, and his trait theories became kind of a new roadmap and a new way of looking at personality. So then Raymond Cattell comes along, and he identifies not 23 source traits, is what he called them. 16 of them were very, very studied. The other, what is it, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, however many that other portion of that is, they were kind of not well defined. They were kind of overlapped with each other and with some of these other 16. So we kind of had to whittle it down. And he got 16 that are fairly distinctive. And this became known as the 16 personality factor. And so these 16 personality factors were different traits that people could have. And then that became the new kind of personality that was studied until Hans Eysenck came along, another fairly big name, a little bit more recent. He proposed a 3-factor model, and he had psychoticism, which is how connected to reality we are. Extroversion is how outgoing or shy a person is. He labeled that personal confidence. And then neuroticism, which is their emotional stability. So do they understand the world around them? That's one trait. How confident are they? That's 2. And then the third one was how emotionally stable are they? And that was going along for a while. And then, what happens in research is you put that research out there to the world, and it gets dissected by other researchers. And sometimes they support it, and sometimes they refute it, and sometimes they add to it. So people added to his categories. They thought these are really good. But I think there's 2 more that don't neatly fit into any of these, but they're super important. So eventually it was settled on 5, and that is still sort of the case today. The Big 5 theory of personality is what it's known as. So this is a trait theory that identifies those same 3 and then the additional 2 that researchers came on afterwards, and they go by the acronym OCEAN, and it stands for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And I'm going to go through those 5. And then I found this, and I think we should have a 4-factor theory of personality. And this is somebody that's a decent person. This is meticulous. This is the right way to be, by the way. And then we have your careless people who put this on backwards. And if you think this is the right way to do it, well, you're wrong. If you look up the patent in the U.S. Patent Office for toilet paper dispenser, it shows this, not this. So the inventor says that it's over the top, not around the back. Who wants to reach around the back and pull the toilet paper down? I mean, what if there's a spider on there or something? You can't even see it. At least if you pull this down, the spider comes around the roll and you see it before you touch it, right? Does that make sense? So yeah, this is the right way. This is the wrong way. This is the lazy way. And these people suck. And then, people that just leave it and don't replace it, they're the worst. That's like 9th circle of hell, probably. I don't know what's wrong with these people. Psychopathic deviants, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, that's my 4-factor theory of personality. All right, so let's go through the 5. Openness. People who score. Now, all of these, by the way, these 5 traits, openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, and whichever the one that I missed was, all of these are graded on a spectrum. They're not either have it or no, or yes or no. They're all sort of gradient spectrums. So openness, people that score really high, meaning they're very open people, they're very curious. They're usually very unconventional. They're very imaginative. These are the people that take new routes going home just for change of pace and scenery. They might change jobs quite a bit if that's possible, unless their job is such a necessity to bills and whatnot. But like when you're young, you don't have a ton of bills. Just change jobs on a whim. When I was 16. Man, I changed jobs like every 6 months just to do something different. I waited tables for 6 months, and then I was like, tired of this. Then I was a photographer at Olin Mills for like 3 months. I was like, I don't really like that. See what I do after that. I worked in an eyeglasses place where I made eyeglasses. I did that for a while because I just wanted a job where I worked with my hands. I thought that'd be cool. Did that for a while. Then it was summertime, and I decided I want to be a lifeguard, so I was a lifeguard for a while. I'm a very open person. I'm open to new experiences. Um, People that score high on this involve fantasy, feelings, actions, ideas, values. Like they're always kind of curious to learn new things, right? They're open to new cultures and new ways of thinking and new foods, new relationships. They get bored in relationships pretty quickly. Uh, Now, people that are on the other end of the spectrum, right, that score low, basically they're the opposite of all this. They're very practical. They're very traditional. They're very comforting. They prefer the familiar to the new. They take the same route to and from. They go to the same favorite restaurants. They order the same dishes at those restaurants. And there's something about the comfort of the same thing. I know what I get is going to be good. And that's comforting. I go to a new restaurant and I pick a new food. I could be in for a surprise. It could be the best thing I ever had. Or, that's not very good. I don't really like that, right? And there's something about not knowing that's exciting. And there's something about the possibility of discovering my new favorite dish is worth the letdown of, yeah, this place sucks. I don't really like this place, right? So it's just different ways of thinking. It's different personalities. Some people like the openness and some people are the other way. All right, a couple of examples. Einstein. Einstein was a patent clerk who was looking at a clock on a building down the road, and he started thinking about what allowed him to be able to see that, right? So sensation and perception. And he thought, there's a light ray that traveled from the sun all the way 8.5 minutes at the speed of light, broke our atmosphere, traveled down and hit that clock, and then bounced off of that clock and went all the way into my eye that allowed me to see that clock down the road. What if I was riding that like it was a horse? How long would it take for me to ride that? And then what would the light do to bounce off of that and get? And that's how he came up with his theory of relativity, was thinking along those lines. Dude, that is super unconventional for a scientist. Very imaginative for him to think that way, or about riding a beam of light like a horse. Now, imagine Spock telling you something like that. I don't think Spock has that kind of curious nature, right? He's very practical. He's very traditional. He looks at something. He would explain it in terms of physics. He would not, picture riding it like a horse. So, both scientists, both real people, by the way, I'm convinced. But very different ways of approaching their profession. Both very good at their profession, but they approach it differently. So one's very open, one's not very open. All right, conscientiousness. This incorporates competencies, order, dutifulness, achievement striving, self-discipline, and deliberation. I am firmly convinced that the world sucks mostly today because we have lost this as a society. Don't be mad at me or think that I'm the old guy picking on the young kids, but the newer generations, I think, have just lost all sense of common courtesy, decency for one another. People don't hold open doors for people anymore. People don't have common courtesy. People talk on their cell phones on speaker in waiting rooms because they suck. Driving, everybody sucks. So that's my feeling on this. Is most people, I think, score very low on this conscientiousness scale now. High scores are very reliable. They're very hardworking. They're very punctual. They like to plan things because, again, if you plan things, you can be on time. You can not let somebody else down. If you're spontaneously leaving and did I spell that right? I don't think that's spelled right. It's all right. People that score low are lazy and unreliable. They can add value to teams. So I'm trying to say something nice about people that have low conscientiousness. There's not a lot that can be said that's nice, but I mentioned in the book that because you don't want to say this is a good quality, this is a bad quality. All of these are just qualities, right? We should not make any judgments as to an open person is good and a closed person is bad. There's something to be said for people that are very by the book and they go to the same restaurants and they take the same. They're very reliable people. So this is not a bad thing to be low on the openness scale. Like I said, Spock is great at his job, not very open, right? Very practical, very traditional, but very good at his job. So all of these spectrums are just a way to sort of understand a personality, but not a way to judge them, all right? We get a little judgmental when we talk about this one. I specifically do because it's kind of a nerve for me. But, you put somebody that scores very low in conscientiousness on a team, the only thing that I could find research-wise that spoke positively of this bad quality was that a lot of times they will think of a smarter way to work because they're lazy. They will sometimes try to think outside the box and find a shortcut, a way that the job can be done easier instead of having to work hard. And that's not always a terrible thing, right? But yeah, pretty much everything else about this one sucks. All right, so here's a couple other good examples. RoboCop. By the way, if you haven't seen the original Peter Weller, you need to do yourself a favor and watch that classic '80s movie. The remake, don't bother. So RoboCop had just a few goals. He had four directives, three directives, whatever it was. Those were his goals, right? He was self-disciplined. He was responsible. He was careful. Remember the scene? If you haven't seen the movie, there's a scene where somebody's holding a hostage and he's got him at gunpoint. And he's like, oh, what do I do? And so he takes a scan of the whole area and he realizes I can shoot here and then the bullet would ricochet from here to here to here and then hit the bad guy and nobody else would get hurt. So that's what he does. That one clean shot, pew, 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 hits the bad guy, right? Very responsible not to hurt the bad guy or the hostage, right? And then contrast that with Tony Stark, right? Another real life example, by the way. Lots of goals, right? He runs Stark Industries, is a founding member of the Avengers. He's in the Illuminati, if you follow the comics. So lots of things going on. Pretty irresponsible. In the comic books, they didn't play this out in the movies, but in the comic books, he is a raging alcoholic. Bad alcoholic. So it's kind of interesting. Very reckless. Which they did touch on in the movie a little bit. Very disorganized, right? He's got all this stuff going on, and that's why he needs Pepper Potts to always be there, cleaning up his messes. So again, both very good at their jobs. I would say that RoboCop is very conscientious versus Iron Man, not so much. He's a little more narcissistic, a little less conscientiousness. All right, these you've already heard of. I know everybody; these are familiar terms. Extroversion. So somebody that is an extrovert is characterized by warmth, gregariousness, that's a $5 college word for talkative, assertiveness, activity, and excitement seeking. These are outgoing people, right? Generally, they're positive emotionally, although they can be somewhat insensitive and overbearing, all right? You get that person that always has to be in the limelight. They always have to be the center of attention. That's an overly extroverted person, an overly outgoing person. Sometimes they can get kind of annoying. They seek out social gatherings, interpersonal. They're people. They want to be in crowds. They want to be at parties. They want to go to clubs. They want to be talking in class all the time, right? They want to raise their hand and they want to tell a story. They want all eyes on them, right? That's a very extroverted person. They freely express their feelings. Now, in contrast to that is an introvert. Now, an introvert is characterized by coolness, reserve, passivity, and caution. They tend to be sensitive and reflective. They tend to seek out social gatherings. They're less likely to seek out social gatherings because they prefer alone time. They just would rather be home. They generally don't express their feelings. All of this is sort of... So when you think of an extrovert and an introvert, you think of an outgoing person and a shy person, right? I found this graphic, and I'm going to make it big so you can really read this. I really, really liked this quite a bit. So contrary to what most people think, an introvert is not simply a person that's shy. A person that's more concerned with the inner world of their own mind. It's a person who enjoys thinking and exploring their thoughts and feelings. It's more fun to think through things than to go out and just listen to somebody else or talk to somebody else that's not on the same level, right, intellectually. A person who is energized by being alone and whose energy is drained by being around people. I really like that one. Someone who enjoys conversations about ideas and concepts and gets bored with small talk. That was a very famous quote by Eleanor Roosevelt. She said, small minds talk about people, big minds talk about ideas, or something like that. I forget the quote exactly, but it was along those lines. So I'm curious what you guys would think, and this is usually what I ask the class. Do you think I would be an introvert or an extrovert? Most people would say, oh, you seem like an extrovert. And I'm a pretty confident person, so I think people, and I don't get shy, and I publicly speak for a living, so, that's all the makings of an extrovert, right? I mean, they're confident in crowds, speak to public, and, you're not shy, that means you're an extrovert. I am very much an introvert. I have 2 friends in the world. One of them lives in another city, and the other one I only talk to about 3 times a year. And it's by choice. I mean, I could make friends if I want, but they're super needy. Like, friends always need stuff, and who has time for that? So I am fine with reading what I read and watching what I watch and the hobbies that I have, pursuing those. And I don't need to meet buddies at a bar. I don't need to get up at 5 in the morning to go hunt or fish or whatever guys do. I don't need all that stuff. I can occupy my mind just fine day after day with really I could live, they say no man is an island. I really honestly think I could live alone on an island. I'd be okay. So I am very much an introvert. And it's not because I'm shy. It's not because I'm not confident around people. It's just my preference. My social preference is the fewer the better. So a little bit of a misnomer about introverts and extroverts. So my first thing that I thought of for some reason on an extrovert is Muhammad Ali. Very sociable, very talkative, very assertive, obviously very confident. Loved being in front of the cameras at press conferences. Really stole the show every time he did a press conference. And then an introvert, again, I think somewhat like myself, was it Sheldon? I didn't watch a lot of this show, but he has friends, right? He has social gatherings all the time with those same friends, but he has a small group of friends, and he could kind of seem like take it or leave it most of the time. Even when his friends were around, a lot of times he'd be sitting over here at his computer while they were over here playing a game, and he's sort of half listening. Not that he can't be around people, but just he chooses not to. So energized by being alone. I really like that part. All right, moving on. Agreeableness. People that are very agreeable tend to be people pleasers to some extent. So they includes trustworthiness, altruism, compliance, modesty, and tender-mindedness. They are people that seek other people's approval over their own. I'll never forget once. I'm not this at all, by the way. I'm very low scoring on this. Cynical, uncooperative. I don't feel like I'm rude, but I guess I can be. I don't have a lot of empathy for people that are doing dumb things. And so, I will point out that that's dumb in not so nice words sometimes. So, yeah, I guess I can be kind of rude, but, I try not to be, but, the world sucks sometimes. So, but yeah, people that are agreeableness, score high on this are just so weird to me because it is just so far from me. So my ex-wife was like this, and it was so bizarre that I never even noticed it for years. But I'll never forget, ex-friend of mine and I used to watch every single UFC at Buffalo Wild Wings. I mean, without fail, if there was UFC, we were there watching it. And we were in this church group together. And this new guy came in the group, and he had this big, nice house with this big, nice media room that had several recliners and couches in it, big projector TV, and this guy was loaded. And there was a UFC fight coming up, and he invited the whole group to go watch it there. And everybody's like, yeah, we should do that. That'd be great. And everybody was going to go. And then it got to Richard and myself, and Richard's like, I don't want to go. We're going to go to Buffalo. And I remember, even though it was part of the conversation, over here, like to the side, was my now ex-wife, and she just went, oh. Like her eyes, and literally, like her jaw just dropped. And And so I was like, yeah, I don't really want to go either. I'd rather go to Buffalo. I was like, no offense. It's kind of a tradition, and I like the atmosphere and I like the food, and screens are good, and I just been doing it for so long. I don't really want to change that now. I said, maybe we could go over there and do something else over there another time, a football game or something, which I don't care about football, but I'd go over there and watch a game just to hang out or whatever, sure. So Richard and I went to Buffalo, and we did our thing, and everybody else went to his house, and they had fun, and that's fine. But I remember later asking my ex, like, why did you have that reaction? She goes, I cannot believe that he didn't go with the crowd. I would have been like, oh yeah, let's do that. Even if I didn't want to, the whole place already agreed that they wanted to go. I'm not going to be the one dissenting person. And I just was like, but I didn't want to go. I wanted to go to Buffalo, so I don't want to go to that guy's house. Why would I say, yes, I'll go, and I don't want to do that? That doesn't make any sense. And she's like, well, I do that all the time. You'll say, where do you want to eat? I'll say, I don't care. And you'll say, how about Chili's? And I'll say, sure. And I hate Chili's. I don't like anything on their menu. I'm like, then why do you say yes? I don't understand that. I just because I don't want to be a bother. I don't want to be, I don't want somebody to think that I'm not agreeable. That just does not compute. I'm not wired that way at all. So anyway, those people are fascinating to me. All right, Dalai Lama. He's pretty agreeable, gentle, good-natured. I would say Trump, probably not real high on the agreeableness scale. All right, the last thing here is neuroticism. Neuroticism is kind of a big, encompassing word, meaning a lot of things. It combines things like anxiety, angry, hostility, depression, self-consciousness, impulsivity, shyness, vulnerability. Basically, all of those negative words I said earlier that kind of all come together in a package. One can be converted to another one fairly easily. All of those, basically. They respond very poorly to stressors because they pretty much live their life stressed already. So you add another stress to it, they don't respond well to that. They're more likely to interpret ordinary situations as threatening because they're sort of hyper-vigilant that the world's against them. So if there's one little slight over here that's just kind of a thing, they take it personal, like it's against them, when it may not be. Trouble controlling urges and delaying gratification. They're very id-driven, right? Their ego is somewhat underdeveloped. The opposite of being neurotic would be somebody that's very emotionally stable, right? They're very calm, they're very even-tempered, very confident that they can handle whatever comes their way. So examples there, I got 007 for the, poised, calm, secure, like nothing ever, flusters him, right? I can handle this. And then if you're a Seinfeld fan, this is absolutely the poster child for neuroticism. George, was that actor? Jason Alexander did a fantastic job of playing this neurotic, nervous all the time, depressed, reactive, insecure person. All right, so let's talk about personality inventories to sum up this chapter. So personality inventories, an inventory is a paper and pencil test. Obviously, a lot of tests now are computerized, so it's not technically paper and pencil. But a paper and pencil test with questions about a person's thoughts, their feelings, and their behaviors. And it measures several dimensions of personality, and it can be scored according to a standard procedure of scoring. Now, the gold standard that is one of the most widely used psychological tests administered today, and that has been for a very long time, is called the MMPI, or the the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. It was developed in the 1940s at the University of Minnesota. The original has 567 true and false questions. It takes forever. Now the questions are short, and they're just true or false, so you don't have to read a bunch of multiple choice, but 567 questions takes a minute to read, right? I've taken the MMPI probably 50 times because I actually went to the University of Minnesota for that portion of my grad school, and they actually taught the MMPI in the room that the test was invented. So I have more knowledge of this test than I ever wanted. I have read 4 or 5 books on this test, and I've therefore taken it many, many times. In grad school, I have also taken it in pre-employment, law enforcement, almost every law enforcement agency uses some version of the MMPI to assess personality. So the MMPI 2RF, it's the revised format. It narrowed this down from 567 questions down to 338. One of the biggest complaints is the test is just so freaking long. And, with a little bit more research, they decided they can kind of throw out some of these questions and add them to other questions, combine some stuff and shorten it up a little bit and still get the same results. So this is what it measures. It looks at, I believe, 10 different components of personality. The first one it looks at is hypochondriasis. And by the way, this is the initials that are on the test. And I'm going to show you a test form in just a second so you can see what these letters are. So hypochondriasis are concerns over physical health. And it'll ask you questions about, sometimes I'm afraid that I will become sick with a terminal illness. Sometimes I'm afraid that I don't wash my hands enough and I could catch something. It'll ask questions along those. Those are not the actual questions, but it'll ask questions in that manner. It asks questions about depression, pretty cut and dry. It asks questions about what's looking for hysteria. Hysteria is complaints about physical symptoms that have no organic cause. So these are people who have, they feel a rash on their skin, but you can't see it, and it doesn't come up on any test, and there's no reason that they would have it. Or they feel like they're, they're not able to see very well, but then you put them on an ophthalmologist scope and they look and they computerized measure the retina and everything is squared away. So, sometimes people have these physical symptoms that don't really have any organic cause. It's really just a mental thing. So that's a hysteria. Psychopathic deviant, that's disregard for social and moral standards. So it'll ask you questions about kind of right and wrong, like, I sometimes think it's right to do this, or I think it's wrong to do this. And sometimes people get those questions wrong. They don't have that super ego rule book. This is an interesting one. It looks at common tests of masculinity and femininity. And these are the traditional social standards for gender. Now, we live in a crazy time right now where this is dramatically changing. So it will be really interesting to see what this particular test, because it's not going away, when they do the MMPI 3, or whatever the next revision is going to be called, what are they going to do with this masculinity-femininity scale? Because this is, in and of itself, a little bit sexist. Because there really are no traditional roles anymore. I think skinny jeans on guys are horrible, right? But there are people that wear skinny jeans, and if I were to say, I think your jeans are horrible, I'm the bad guy. I'm not allowed to have that thought. I can't think that. So there's the traditional roles have really kind of been upturned and stood on their head lately. Paranoia, it looks at, which is extreme suspiciousness or fear of persecution, right? Everybody knows paranoia. Synesthesia, I can't ever say that right. Psychasthenia, that's what it is. Psychasthenia. Tends to be anxious, rigid, tense, and worrying. These are like your worry warts. Basically, looks for that. Schizophrenia, we'll talk about that in chapter 15. This is bizarre and unusual thinking. These are people that are distanced from reality quite a bit. Hypomania is the emotional, excitable, energetic, and impulsive people. Social introverts, again, just looking at introversion. And this test has a very interesting thing. It's a built-in lie detector. Again, when you have 567 questions, you can kind of ask the same question 200 questions later and see if you get the same answer. And what tends to happen is you answer the question the way you think they want you to answer it the first time, but man, by the time you've read 400 something questions, you're fatigued. So you get to a point where you're just like, I'm just going to answer honestly. Like, you tend to get more honest as you get more tired, right? And so it looks to see, were you consistent in your answer? The other thing is it might ask the question in a different way, and you might lie the first time, but you're kind of tricked the second time because it's worded a little bit different. And so it's looking to see if you're trying to give answers that are socially acceptable, but might not. Because if you tell the, so who was it that said this? Was it Roy Rogers, or actually I think it was Ralph Waldo Emerson that said, if you tell the truth, you never have to remember anything if you always tell the truth. In other words, if you're telling the truth, right, you just kind of think back and you retell that event. If you tell a lie, you have to remember the lie. Your brain doesn't memorize lies the same way that it does things that actually happened, right? Because a lie is abstract. It didn't happen. There was no sight or sound or whatever to what it was. It was just a manufactured truth to get you out of trouble or to make you look good or whatever the reason for your lie was. And so remembering that is a lot harder. So whenever, as you fatigue taking this long test, you don't remember what you said before, and so the theory being you're going to give those socially acceptable answers early on, but later on you're probably going to be more truthful. So very brilliantly done. And that's these L scale and the F scale and the K scale. That's this lie and the socially acceptable and the consistency scales. That's what these are. And you can't really see it too well on this results sheet, but there are kind of parameters here. I want to say it's 70. I may not be right on that, but it's on the physical paper. I think it's 30 and 70. This is like a bolded line, so this would be within the normal range. And then here's those 10 scales that I was talking about. The D. This is the depression one. So it looks same. Yeah. So this is 70. So if you look here, this D is a little north of 70. It's about 75. So they're a little high on the depression scale. This whole personality profile is pretty elevated. I mean, you see this is the high normal right here, and this whole scale is kind of roughly on the high side. So what you would want to see is something kind of down here in the middle. So, but the depression scale is a little high. Their masculinity, femininity scale is a little high. So this one is a male. And the fact that they scored here means that they scored very high on the masculine side. So this is going to be like your very kind of alpha, aggressive, type A personality kind of male. And then here the PA is paranoia. They're going to be pretty high. This actually looks like a police officer's profile. Typically, you're going to see a pretty elevated profile overall. You're going to see a high masculinity. Even in the female, you'll see the reverse is true. You'll see a low femininity score for them. And that makes sense because, law enforcement has always attracted more males than females. And for the longest time, it was dominated by males. We've evened that out quite a bit through different hiring practices, but it does still tend to attract more men than women. So when you have a woman that is attracted to law enforcement, you're probably going to get a lower femininity scale, usually. Let's see, everything else in here is kind of normal. But yeah, this is what the actual test would look like when it comes back. All right, so this is the Myers-Briggs type indicator. Remember that 16 PF? Well, there's 4 here and 4 here. 4 times 4 is 16. So whenever you match that up, you get 16 different possible. You can either be extrovert or introversion. You can either be sensing or intuitive. You can be thinking or feeling or judging or perceiving, and then any combination of those. So when you look at that, like an ISTJ would be an I, an S, a T, and a J. So you get this one and then these 3 top one. And then what ISFJ, well, of course, that would be ISFJ. So it's the same as that, but the feeling and thinking were reversed. So this is kind of an interesting thing. I'll let you look at that on your own. But like for instance, ISTJ would be responsible, sincere, analytical, reserved, realistic, systematic. They're hardworking and trustworthy with sound practical judgment. So this is a type indicator, and if you go online and you just do a search for 16 PF or 16 personality factor test or something like that, I'm sure you can Google it and you can take this test. I don't know how many questions it are. It's probably 40 or so questions, somewhere in that ballpark. And it's basically, would you rather do this or rather do this? Would you rather have this or would you rather have that? And at the end of it, it'll tell you which one of these squares that you are. So this is kind of an interesting thing to look at. I think this is like horoscopes. I did the test. I forget which one I was. But I read the box that corresponds to what my score was. I'm like, oh my God, that's totally me. But then I read the box next to it, and I'm like, oh my God, that's totally me. And out of these 16, I probably feel like I fit like 12 of them. There's a few that I'm like, yeah, that's probably not me. But for the most part, I think I could kind of fit in several of these. So, I take this a little bit with a grain of salt, but it is kind of neat to see what you come out as after taking the test. All right, last thing, projective tests. So projective tests are my very favorite tests. IQ tests and all the different kinds of tests that we've talked about before. I think these are cool because this is one of the differences between an LPC and a PhD psychologist. LPCs don't have, generally speaking, they don't have the schooling to have the full, robust knowledge that goes into these tests, so they can't administer them. So an LPC typically is not going to be giving a projective test because, again, they don't really have that fundamental theoretical background knowledge to how to do it and how to interpret it and make it make sense. So you're going to get these more typically from like your clinical psychologist. But a projective test is a personality test in which people respond to ink blots. That's one kind. That's the Rorschach. Drawings of ambiguous human situations or incomplete sentences by projecting their inner thoughts, feelings, fears, or conflicts onto the test material. So the way that it kind of works is this, and I'm going to skip ahead and I'm going to show you my favorite one. This one is called the thematic apperception test. Now, all of these pictures were developed for this test, and they're supposed to be copywritten, which means nobody's supposed to ever put them on the internet, but people do. So people suck, and because they suck, I can pull these two and I can show you, so I guess I suck too. So the way this test works is I'm going to give you this drawing of this ambiguous situation, and I'm going to say, tell me what's happening here. That's it. And you tell me a story. So when I taught English for 1 year, we have to write all the time. So this was a writing test. So I basically did a psychoanalysis of all 109 of my students by giving this thematic apperception test as an English assignment without them knowing what it was. Is that unethical? No, it's not unethical. It's totally cool. So I said, okay, write me a story about what's going on here. Make sure it has a beginning, middle, and an end. Make sure it has a protagonist and an antagonist. Whatever it was that we were studying, I made it fit the curriculum, right? So, I'm talking to 10th graders. I'm getting a lot of, well, he came home and his wife was naked and she wanted to have sex. Okay? I don't know about you, but she looks dead to me, right? So that's not the story that I would come up with. But I'm also not a puberty driven by hormone, dude that sees this and thinks boobs, right? That's not the first thing that comes out. Honestly, the first thing that comes out to me, I guess because of my cop background, is crime scene, right? It looks like a dead person. He walks in, he sees it, and I'm thinking, man, he is trampling all over evidence. Like, I hope he's not touching anything, right? So that's me projecting my experiences into this picture. And what people don't realize is they don't realize that they do that. So here's kind of the way that it works, right? You don't just give them one, right? You give them a series of these pictures, and they're look at the difference in these two. These actually are fairly similar, believe it or not. There's one that's it's like a tree, and there's like a person under the tree reading a book, and then there's farmers back here working on a farm, and there's a few people walking by right here. And you say, tell me what's happening here. So they're very different than these, right? These both kind of have a couple in them, which they don't all have. So what I get a lot of, let's say that you get somebody that tells this story and you say, well, he was cheating on his wife and, she found out about it and so she killed herself, and he came home from his girlfriend's house and found out that his wife had killed herself because she discovered the cheating. And you're like, whoa, okay. Tell me what's going on here. Well, he's cheating on his wife, and that's his girlfriend, and he's trying to bring her. And then you're like, oh, okay. Well, tell me about this third one. Well, she's sitting under the tree waiting to meet her boyfriend who's working on this farm, and then this person that's walking by, that's the person that she's got a crush on. And so what happens is in every single story, they're talking about cheating. And they don't even realize that they're contributing the same theme to every picture. And some may lend themselves to that theme a little bit, like a woman lying in bed, or a couple that's having a disagreement. That's one of the things couples might obviously fight about. But a woman on a farm and farmers in the background, how does that have anything to do thematically with infidelity? That doesn't make any sense. So that's that person's fear that they're interjecting into the picture. And they don't even realize they're doing it. So where this is useful is whenever you're doing forensic examinations and you have somebody that's court ordered to go to therapy and they don't want to, so they don't want to talk to you, or you have somebody whose wife pretty much gives them an ultimatum and says, we're doing couples counseling or I want a divorce, and they don't want counseling. They don't want to talk about their business to some stranger, nobody, therapist or whatever. So what happens is they come in and they don't want to talk to you about their personal issues. So you say, okay, that's cool. You don't have to. Tell me a story about this. Tell me a story about this. Tell me a story about this. And you do that 7 or 8 times. And they think, well, this is great. I can do this all day long, right? And then all of a sudden you say, let's talk about cheating. And they're like, what? How do you know? And they don't realize that they've kind of tipped their cards to you, right? They kind of told you what's on their mind because they projected it into these different pictures. So that's how a projective test works. So this in the background here, this is a Rorschach ink blot, and it's the same thing. It's a projective personality test. I have actually not been trained on this one, so I'm not real sure how this one is properly interpreted. But I know that there are certain shapes that look like butterflies or moths. That's a very typical answer. And your very normal average person is going to say, I see a butterfly. There are some that look like certain animals to some extent. I mean, loosely. But if somebody is looking at this picture and they say, I see my ex-wife's brains splattered on the wall. Okay, well, does that look like brains on a wall? Okay, maybe, but if you're being super specific about whose brains it is, we might need to talk, right? We might need to talk about this hostility and anger that you have pent up regarding, this particular person. So that's what's neat about these tests is that people project into them their thoughts and their feelings. They don't even realize that they even have sometimes, and other times they realize they have them, but they didn't realize they were talking about them, and so they put that out there to the world. Now the last one, and I don't have a slide for it. It's called the house tree person, and basically a house is supposed to represent your family life. A tree is supposed to represent your personal life. And then what's the last one? Person is supposed to represent, of course, yourself. And so you simply give them a piece of paper and a pen, and you say, draw a house. And then a second piece of paper, you say, draw a tree. And a third one, you say, draw a person. Now, normally I go on the whiteboard and I'll draw it, and I'll show you. When I took this test in front of my grad school class and then got dissected in front of my grad school class, I was blown away at what this guy was able to ascertain about my life based on what I drew. It was unbelievable to me. I wasn't trying to interject anything, right? I'm trying to draw a freaking tree. So some of the things on that particular test, so if you imagine I have a piece of paper here, actually I can probably just do it real quick. I have a piece of paper. So I'm going to draw a house really quick like I would on the whiteboard. And then I'll hold it up. All right, so I say draw a house, and I get something like this. Okay, I'm gonna hold this up. All right. So is that pretty typical of what you might see? Yeah, probably a little bit more to it than that. But this test would go into the nuanced details of what you drew because they all represent something. You're projecting into your picture your thoughts and your feelings about your home life. Now, what's odd about this picture? Have you ever seen a house in your life that doesn't have any windows? I didn't draw any windows. So I'm projecting some sense of privacy. Here's my house, but I don't want you to know what goes on inside that house. Probably because bad stuff goes on, right? Now, how starkly different is that house versus that house? Not only do I have windows, but those windows are disproportionately larger than the door, right? I want everybody to see what's going on in this house, right? Image is important. I want people to see something. I don't necessarily want them to come in and examine that, though. This might be a red flag. I mean, that's how nuanced these tests can be. Every single component of the picture means something. Now, is it going to be right? Is it going to be accurate? Maybe I just suck at drawing, right? And I didn't realize that I drew them all out of proportion. Sure, of course that's possible. There is no guarantee. There's no accuracy, statistics on this, but it's still a talking point. What about the fact that this house is not grounded? It's floating. That could represent some distance from reality. I'm not particularly in touch with reality because I'm not even touching the ground. There's no walkway. What about the fact that I have a sun over here? That's nice. But I have smoke coming out of the chimney. This could represent warmth inside the house, right? And this represents my sunny outlook on life. So that's very positive to have. It's not very congruent. Normally we wouldn't have this on a sunny day, right? But the fact that I drew this here representing warmth and this here sunny and cheerful, right? That's a very positive thing. So those are the things that you look for, and then there's certain things with the person. Did they draw a profile or a face on? The proportion of eyes, ears, mouth, nose, all that kind of stuff. How are they dressed? What position are they in? I mean, all of these things matter. They mean something. So, in a projective test, just remember that you are projecting into the picture some piece of your personality, some thought, some feeling, some behavior, whatever, and a trained interpreter for that test would be able to sort of decipher that. You'd be able to sense the themes that are going on in this one. There's another one where it's word sentence completion, and I have you complete incomplete sentences, and again, I'm looking for themes. What are you always gravitating to? Then the pictures, there's the Rorschach and whatnot. So anyway, so that's everything. 39 slides. That's probably 2.5 weeks worth of lectures I'll put into this one. So a lot of stuff in this chapter. Probably a lot more than you wanted. But I promise this is the very longest chapter of the entire textbook. So going forward, they will all be much shorter in comparison. So I'm going to shut up now and remember how to turn this off. Command, Control, Escape. Command, Control. See you for the next one.